He didn't stalk dark alleys. He didn't hide in shadows. He didn't look like a monster. He drove America's highways, asked for help, offered rides, and vanished into traffic, while dozens of women disappeared behind him. For years, no one saw the pattern. No one knew his name. No one suspected the quiet drifter sitting beside them at a gas station. Until the day he started talking and revealed one of the most horrifying confessions in American criminal history. This is the true story of Gerald Eugene Stano. Thank you for being here for this important and difficult story. These moments aren't easy to hear, but understanding them helps us honor the voices that were lost and remain aware of the world around us. If this series adds value, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps the channel grow. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Boy in 01 Wanted. Silence can be one of the most powerful forces in shaping a human life. Not the peaceful kind of silence that settles over a sleeping house in the early hours of the morning, but a heavier, more oppressive silence. The kind that grows in the absence of care. The kind that forms when a child cries and no one comes. The kind that slowly teaches a young mind that it is invisible. This is where the story begins. Not with blood, not with headlines, not with police sirens or courtroom cameras. The IT begins with a baby boy born into a world already unwilling to make space for him. Gerald Eugene Stano entered life without ceremony, without celebration, and without a family waiting eagerly to hold him close. His biological mother, young and overwhelmed, made a decision that would echo through decades of horror. She gave him up. Whether it was desperation, fear, poverty, or shame, history never fully clarified. What remains certain is this. Gerald's first experience of the world was abandonment. He was placed into the foster system, an institutional maze that, in theory, existed to protect vulnerable children. In reality, during the era in which Gerald was born, it often functioned as a revolving door of temporary homes, inconsistent supervision, and emotional neglect. For many children, it was a difficult but survivable experience. For others, it became the first fracture in a long line of psychological breaks. Gerald was one of the latter. From an early age, he learned that nothing in life was permanent. Homes changed. Caretakers changed. Faces came and went. Attachments, when they formed at all, were fragile and brief. There was no stable adult figure to teach him what love looked like, what safety felt like, or how to regulate emotions that in these early years. Gerald did not yet resemble a monster. He was small, quiet, often described as withdrawn. But beneath that stillness, something was already stirring. Children develop their understanding of the world through repetition. When a child is consistently comforted, they learn that pain can be soothed. When they are consistently fed, they learn that needs will be met. When they are consistently protected, they learn that the world, while imperfect, contains safety. To Gerald's experiences taught him the opposite. Needs were ignored. Cries went unanswered. Affection was rare, if present at all. The lesson became simple and absolute. You are alone. Over time, loneliness becomes more than an emotion. It becomes an identity. Gerald drifted from placement to placement, each move reinforcing the idea that he was disposable. Records from his childhood are fragmented, but patterns emerge. Caregivers described behavioral problems at an unusually young age. He struggled to follow rules. He had difficulty forming friendships. He often appeared emotionally distant, as though watching the world rather than participating in it. Teachers noticed that Gerald seemed disconnected. While other children played, laughed, and fought over toys, he frequently sat by himself, observing. Observation, in itself, is not sinister, but in Gerald's case, it came with an undercurrent of resentment. He watched other children receive affection, He watched families pick up their kids after school. He watched laughter unfold around him without being invited into a child who feels invisible. These small moments become unbearable. Psychologists later theorized that Gerald developed a deep sense of humiliation early in life. Not embarrassment, but something more corrosive. A belief that he was fundamentally inferior, that he existed on the lowest rung of humanity. Humiliation does not always turn inward. Sometimes it turns outward around the age when most children begin to develop empathy. Gerald seemed to lack it. Reports indicated that he displayed cruelty toward animals. Small acts at first, pulling legs, throwing objects, watching reactions with detached curiosity. These behaviors are not guarantees of future violence. Many children who display early aggression grow up to become functional, nonviolent adults when given proper intervention. Gerald did not receive intervention, but he received neglect as the years passed. His behavior grew more troubling. He became known for lying compulsively, not for any clear gain, but seemingly to create small worlds in which he had control. He would fabricate stories about his background, his abilities, his experiences. Each lie became a brick in a fantasy version of himself in reality. He felt powerless in fantasy. He could be anything. This contrast between inner worthlessness and imagined power would become a defining feature of his psyche. Eventually, Gerald was adopted by a couple who hoped to provide him with stability. On paper, this was the turning point. A chance at normalcy, a chance at healing. But damage done in early childhood does not vanish simply because circumstances improve. The adoptive household was strict. Expectations were clear. Structure was enforced. For many children, structure provides safety. For Gerald, it felt like another form of control imposed from the outside that he struggled academically. His cognitive development lagged behind his peers. Testing later revealed that his IQ fell in the below-average range, limiting his ability to process complex information, plan long-term, or fully grasp consequences. This did not make him incapable of understanding right from wrong, but it did make his world smaller, simpler, more impulsive. School became a daily reminder of his perceived inadequacy. He was teased for his awkwardness, mocked for his slow learning, isolated socially. Every insult carved deeper into an already fractured self-image at home. Discipline was often harsh. Misbehavior was punished swiftly. But punishment without emotional guidance rarely teaches insight. It teaches fear. It teaches secrecy. Gerald learned how to hide his thoughts. He learned how to present a version of himself that avoided immediate trouble. Inside, however, resentment continued to grow by adolescence. Gerald had developed a strong interest in sexual material. This alone is not unusual. Puberty brings curiosity, desire, and confusion for most teenagers. What made Gerald different was the way sexuality became entangled with power, anger, and humiliation. He reportedly engaged in compulsive masturbation. He sought out pornography obsessively. He began to view sex not as a shared experience, but as something owed to him. Women, in his developing worldview, were not individuals with autonomy. They were objects, symbols, stand-ins for everything he felt denied at the same time. Gerald struggled to form genuine romantic relationships. His awkwardness, limited social skills, and poor self-esteem made dating extremely difficult. Rejection became routine. Each rejection reinforced a narrative he already believed. I am unwanted, I am unlovable. The world owes me something. This combination, sexual frustration, emotional immaturity, and deep-seated resentment, is a volatile mix. But still, at this stage, no one labeled Gerald a future killer. He was seen as troubled, odd, slowed at a young man drifting through life without direction. As he reached adulthood, Gerald failed to establish any stable career. He took low-paying, temporary jobs. Many ended quickly due to poor performance or conflicts with supervisors. Authority figures triggered him. Being told what to do reminded him of childhood powerlessness. Rather than building a life, Gerald began to drift. He became a drifter in the most literal sense, moving from town to town, living in cheap motels, sleeping in his car, occasionally staying with acquaintances. This transient lifestyle suited him in one crucial way. It left no lasting trail. No one knew him well. No one watched him closely. No one expected anything from him. The outside world. Gerald Eugene Stano was invisible, and invisibility, to someone who has felt ignored his entire life, can feel like both punishment and permission. Permission to exist outside normal rules. Permission to act without being seen. Permission to explore darker impulses without accountability. Inside Gerald's mind, fantasies began to shift, and no longer were they only about sex. They began to include control, dominance, total power over another human being. In his fantasies, he was no longer the rejected boy. He was the one in charge, the one who decided who lived, who suffered, who begged. These thoughts did not arrive fully formed. They evolved slowly, quietly, over years, like rust spreading beneath the surface. By the time Gerald reached his early 20s, the boy no one wanted had become a man no one truly knew. A man carrying a lifetime of abandonment, humiliation, and rage. A man whose inner world was increasingly disconnected from reality. A man standing at the edge of a line. On one side was a difficult but still salvageable life. On the other was something far darker. Soon, Gerald Eugene Stano would take his first irreversible step, and once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. The moment when a human being crosses from thought into action is rarely loud. It does not always arrive with a dramatic event or a clear, conscious decision. More often, it slips in quietly. A small compromise, a secret indulgence, a line bent, then slowly erased. For Gerald Eugene Stano, the path toward violence did not begin with murder. It began with permission. Permission he gave himself. In his early 20s, Gerald continued drifting through Florida and neighboring states, surviving on short-term work and government assistance. He spent long stretches alone, filling empty hours with fantasy, pornography, and daydreams of control. His sexual fantasies grew more elaborate, no longer passive, no longer focused on mutual desire. They revolved around dominance, submission, and humiliation. In these imagined scenarios, women were not partners. They were props, silent vessels onto which he projected his anger and longing. When fantasy no longer provided the same release, Gerald began to seek stimulation in the real world. He approached women awkwardly, often in public places like bus stations, shopping centers, and roadside rest stops. His methods were clumsy. Sometimes he pretended to be lost. Sometimes he claimed his car had broken down. Other times he simply asked for help. Most women ignored him. Some were polite but distant. A few engaged briefly before sensing something was off and walking away. Each rejection felt like confirmation of everything Gerald already believed about himself. But occasionally, someone stopped. Occasionally, someone listened. And those moments became fuel, not because they brought connection, but because they proved something dangerous. People could be manipulated. They could be persuaded. They could be drawn close. This realization changed something fundamental inside him. For the first time, Gerald experienced a sense of power over another person. Not physical power, not yet. Psychological power. The knowledge that he could influence behavior, that he could shape outcomes. This discovery was intoxicating. He began experimenting with small acts of deception. He would fabricate emergencies, claim he needed a ride, say he had lost his wallet, pretend to be injured. Each successful interaction reinforced the idea that he could play a role convincingly enough to bypass suspicion at the same time. Gerald's criminal behavior escalated in minor ways. He committed petty theft, shoplifting, stealing from unlocked cars, breaking into abandoned buildings. These acts were less about material gain and more about testing boundaries. How much could he get away with? How invisible was he really? The answer, disturbingly, was very. Law enforcement encounters were rare. When they happened, they were brief. Warnings minor. Charges, nothing that resulted in serious consequences to Gerald. This felt like confirmation that rules did not apply to him in the same way they applied to others. Another dangerous belief took root. I can do what I want. Around this time, Gerald began frequenting areas known for sex work. He lacked the social skills to form conventional relationships, but he could purchase access to a woman's body to him. This did not feel like a transaction between two adults. It felt like ownership. In interviews. Years later, investigators noted that Gerald spoke about these encounters with a strange mixture of entitlement and contempt. He viewed sex workers as less than human, as disposable, not as safe targets. This dehumanization is a critical psychological step in the development of violent offenders. Before someone can seriously harm another person, they must first convince themselves that the victim does not fully count as a person. Gerald had begun doing exactly that. His interactions with women grew more aggressive. That he made inappropriate comments, touched without consent, ignored visible discomfort. Some women shouted at him, some threatened to call police. Most walked away quickly, but each encounter pushed Gerald's internal boundaries a little further. Inside his mind, fantasies of dominance began to merge with real-world rehearsal. He imagined restraining women. He imagined forcing compliance. He imagined silencing resistance. These thoughts did not horrify him. They excited him. Excitement, when paired with lack of empathy and poor impulse control, becomes a powerful engine for violence. Gerald did not wake up one day and decide to become a serial killer. He slid into it. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at some point, Gerald committed his first sexual assault. Details remain murky, partly because he later confessed to numerous crimes and partly because many victims never came forward. What is known is that he discovered something profoundly disturbing. Hurting someone sexually gave him a stronger sense of control than anything he had ever experienced, stronger than fantasy, stronger than lying, stronger than theft. In that moment, a new association formed in his brain. Power equals arousal. From there, the escalation toward murder becomes tragically predictable. For some offenders, sexual assault satisfies their need for dominance. For others, it becomes insufficient. They seek a greater high, a more absolute form of control. Killing represents the ultimate domination, not just over a body, but over existence itself. By the mid-1970s, Gerald's inner world was dominated by violent fantasies. He drove Florida's highways, drifting between cities, carrying these thoughts with him like invisible baggage. He had no stable address, no close relationships, no checking in, no noticing changes in behavior. He existed in the gaps of society. The perfect environment for a predator. His choice of victims reflected both opportunity and psychology. Women traveling alone, hitchhikers, sex workers, young women who appeared vulnerable. Women whose disappearances, he assumed, would not generate immediate alarm. This assumption, sadly, was often correct. During this period, America was grappling with a rising awareness of serial killers. Names like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy dominated headlines. But public understanding of these crimes was still developing. Police departments did not yet share information efficiently. Databases were limited. Patterns were often recognized only after dozens of victims. Gerald benefited from this fragmented system. He also benefited from his own unremarkable appearance. He was not handsome, not charismatic, not particularly memorable. He looked like a drifter, a nobody, which made him easy to overlook. His first known murder likely occurred in the mid-1970s. The exact date is uncertain. The victim's identity, in some cases, remains unknown. What matters more than specifics is what happened psychologically afterward. He did not stop. He did not turn himself in. He did not seek help. He felt relief. Relief from internal pressure. Relief from humiliation. Relief from feeling small. For the first time in his life, Gerald felt powerful. That feeling became addictive. And like any addiction, it required increasing doses. 1 murder became 2.2, became 5.5, became dozens. He developed a routine. Approach, deceive, gain trust, isolate, assault, kill, dispose, drive away. Then repeat to the outside world. Gerald continued to appear as he always had. A quiet drifter. A man passing through. No one suspected that behind his dull exterior existed a predator responsible for an expanding trail of death. Each successful crime reinforced a terrifying belief. I am smarter than everyone. I will never be caught. The boy who once felt invisible now reveled in being unseen. Chapter 2. A childhood shaped by silence and cruelty. Memory is not a perfect recording. It is fragmented, selective, shaped by emotion more than fact. For Gerald Eugene Stano, memory was less like a scrapbook and more like a room filled with broken mirrors. Pieces of childhood reflected back at him in distorted shapes, some sharp, some blurred, some completely missing. But when investigators later tried to trace the origins of his violence, they kept arriving at the same place. Early childhood, not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as a landscape where the foundations of a dangerous personality were quietly laid. Gerald's earliest years unfolded in a haze of impermanence. Foster homes came and went. Each move required adaptation, new rules, new faces, new emotional climates. For a developing brain, stability is not a luxury. It is a necessity. Without it, the world feels unpredictable and threatening. Gerald learned early that adults were unreliable. Some were indifferent. Some were cold. A few were overtly cruel. Records suggest that at least one foster placement involved physical punishment that went beyond discipline. Slaps, strikes, being locked alone in rooms, being denied food. Whether every detail is verifiable or not, what matters most is Gerald's perception that he believed he was being hurt, that he believed he was unwanted. Those beliefs hardened into identity. Children who grow up in nurturing environments internalize a simple truth: I matter. Children who grow up in neglect internalize a different message: I do not matter. That message becomes the lens through which all future experiences are interpreted. When good things happen, they feel temporary. When bad things happen, they feel deserved. That Gerald's sense of self began forming around worthlessness. By the time he was old enough to speak clearly, caregivers noticed that he rarely asked for comfort. He did not run to adults when frightened. He did not seek reassurance when upset. He learned that showing need led nowhere. He stopped showing it. Emotional withdrawal is a common survival strategy for neglected children. That if you expect nothing, you cannot be disappointed. But emotional withdrawal also prevents healthy bonding. Without bonds, empathy struggles to develop. Empathy is not. An automatic human trait that it is learned through experience. When a child is comforted, they learn what comfort feels like. When a child is listened to, they learn that listening matters. When a child is treated gently, they learn gentleness. Gerald's world offered few of these lessons. Instead, it offered chaos at around 6 or 7 years old. Gerald began exhibiting behavioral problems that alarmed teachers and foster parents alike. He lied frequently, not to avoid punishment, not to gain rewards, simply to invent. He would claim things that were obviously untrue. Stories about having a rich family, stories about secret talents, stories about adventures that never happened. These lies were not sophisticated. They were childlike attempts to rewrite reality. In fantasy. He was important. In fantasy. He was admired. In fantasy. He was not the forgotten boy in the corner. Another disturbing pattern emerged. Gerald showed little concern when others were hurt. If a classmate fell and cried, he did not react. If someone was upset, he seemed indifferent. This emotional flatness did not mean he felt nothing. It meant he did not process emotions the way most children did. Psychologists refer to this as affective blunting. Emotions exist, but they are muted, distorted, or poorly understood. This makes it difficult to form moral frameworks based on how actions make others feel. Instead, behavior becomes guided by immediate consequences. Did I get caught? Did I get what I wanted? Did this feel good? As Gerald grew older, curiosity about control began to surface. He was observed bullying smaller children, taking their belongings, threatening them, not in explosive bursts of rage, but in quiet, calculated ways. He seemed to enjoy the moment when another child looked afraid. That look gave him something he rarely experienced: power. For a boy who felt powerless in nearly every other aspect of life, this was intoxicating. It was a small, crude form of validation that I can make something happen, that I can affect someone else's world. Adult intervened in a way that addressed the root of these behaviors. There were punishments, detentions, scoldings, but punishment alone does not teach empathy. It teaches avoidance. Gerald learned how to hide misbehavior, how to act compliant when watched, how to save his darker impulses for private moments. This duality, outer compliance, inner resentment, would later become a defining feature of his adult life. When Gerald was eventually adopted, social workers hoped permanence would stabilize him. The adoptive parents provided food, shelter, and basic care, but emotional warmth was limited. They were not cruel in a dramatic sense. They were distant. Practical. Rules. Focused. In their view. Discipline built character. In Gerald's experience, discipline reinforced the idea that love was conditional. Perform correctly, and you are tolerated. Fail, and you are punished. This transactional model of human relationships would shape how Gerald interacted with others for the rest of his life. People were not individuals with inner worlds. They were tools, obstacles, or sources of gratification. School remained a daily struggle. Gerald lagged academically. He had difficulty reading and writing. Math concepts confused him. He was placed in special education classes, which further separated him from his peers. Children noticed. Children mocked. Being called stupid hurt. But worse than the insults was the sense that they might be true. Low intelligence does not cause violent behavior, but when combined with emotional neglect and chronic humiliation, it can limit a person's ability to cope adaptively. Instead of problem solving, Gerald turned to fantasy. Instead of communication, he turned to withdrawal. Instead of seeking help, he internalized anger. Puberty intensified everything. Hormonal changes collided with an already unstable emotional foundation. Sexual curiosity emerged. But without healthy guidance, N01 talked to Gerald about consent. N01 explained mutual respect. N01 modeled loving relationships. His exposure to sexuality came primarily through pornography and crude conversations with other boys. Pornography became his teacher, and pornography, especially the kind he consumed, framed sex as something taken, not shared. Women were portrayed as objects, they s bodies, as things. This reinforced beliefs he was already developing, that women existed for male pleasure, that their feelings were irrelevant, that resistance was part of the fantasy. These ideas did not immediately turn him into a criminal, but they shaped his internal narrative. They normalized dominance. They eroticized control. They blurred the line between desire and harm. To be wise late teens, Gerald was socially isolated. He had few friends and no meaningful romantic experiences. He spent most of his time alone. Loneliness became a constant companion, but it was not a gentle loneliness. It was bitter, sharp, resentful. He believed others had been handed lives he was denied, happy families, girlfriends, opportunities. He saw himself as cursed, cheated. As Gerald Eugene Stano stepped into early adulthood, the world expected him to function like everyone else, get a job, follow rules, build a life. But expectations mean little when a person has never learned how to meet them. Gerald carried his childhood with him, not as memories neatly stored in the past, but as active forces shaping every decision, every reaction, every impulse. That he moved through his late teens and early 20s in a fog of confusion and resentment. He wanted connection that he did not know how to create it. He wanted respect. He did not know how to earn it. He wanted to feel powerful, and slowly, quietly, he began discovering ways to take it. Employment never lasted long. Gerald drifted between menial labor jobs: dishwasher, janitor, construction helper, warehouse assistant. Positions that required little training and offered little stability. That he struggled to follow instructions. He took criticism personally, that he reacted poorly to authority. Supervisors described him as slow, unreliable, and prone to disappearing without notice. Each termination reinforced his sense of being defective. Rather than motivating self-improvement, failure deepened his withdrawal. Why try if I will fail anyway? This mindset becomes a cage. Inside that cage, unhealthy coping mechanisms flourish. Gerald spent more time alone, more time indulging in fantasy, more time feeding resentments. Sexual frustration intensified. That he wanted intimacy, but he feared rejection. He avoided genuine attempts at dating. Approaching women honestly risked humiliation. Manipulation felt safer. When he lied about who he was, rejection hurt less, because they were rejecting a character, not him. At least, that is how he justified it. He began experimenting with small deceptions, claiming to be younger than he was, claiming to have a job he did not, claiming to be passing through town temporarily. These lies served two purposes. They made him seem more interesting, and they gave him a sense of control over how others perceived him. Control became increasingly important. It was the opposite of how he felt as a child. When Gerald discovered that some women would engage with him, briefly, superficially, if he presented the right story, something shifted. It proved that people could be influenced, that perception could be shaped, that reality was flexible. This realization fed directly into his emerging worldview. Rules were not fixed. Truth was optional. Outcomes could be manipulated. At the same time, Gerald's view of women continued to degrade. That he divided them into categories: those who rejected him, those who could be used, those who existed only in fantasy. Rejection triggered anger. Usage triggered contempt. Fantasy triggered arousal. None of these categories involved mutual respect. In his mind, Women were no longer fully human. They were symbols of desire, of frustration, of power, of revenge. He began frequenting areas where vulnerable women were more likely to be found: bus stations, truck stops, city bars, street corners, places where people passed through and were rarely noticed. He observed body language: who looked tired, who looked alone, who looked uncertain. Observation had always been one of Gerald's strongest skills as a child. He observed to survive as an adult. He observed to hunt at first. He limited himself to conversation. He would strike up awkward exchanges, ask for directions, comment on the weather, offer cigarettes. Most interactions went nowhere, but occasionally someone responded. Occasionally, someone stayed. These small successes reinforced his belief that persistence paid off. He also began engaging in increasingly risky sexual behaviors, exposing himself, touching without consent, making explicit comments. Each time he crossed a line and was not immediately punished, the line moved. This phenomenon is known as behavioral desensitization. The brain becomes accustomed to wrongdoing. What once felt shocking becomes normal. What once caused anxiety becomes routine. Gerald's internal alarm system was slowly eroding. By this stage, he had already committed sexual assaults. Though few were reported, they were pivotal moments. They taught him something terrifying: that he enjoyed hurting women, not just physically, but psychologically. Seeing fear excited him. Hearing pleas stimulated him. Resistance did not discourage him. It encouraged him. This is a crucial distinction. Many people commit sexual offenses driven by impulse, intoxication, or poor judgment. Gerald's offenses were driven by desire for dominance. He wanted to feel in control. To decide what happened. To override another person's will. This desire for absolute control is one of the most dangerous traits in violent offenders, because it rarely stops at sexual assault. Eventually, the ultimate form of control becomes attractive: taking a life. During this period, Gerald began to fantasize about killing, not in abstract ways, but in specific, detailed scenarios. He imagined strangling women, imagined watching life leave their eyes, imagined disposing of bodies where they would never be found. These fantasies did not cause guilt, they caused excitement. Fantasy and reality were inching closer together. One small step at a time. There was no dramatic turning point, and no single traumatic event that suddenly made Gerald a killer. It was accumulation. Years of neglect, years of humiliation, years of isolation, years of unaddressed pathology, all compressing into a personality that lacked empathy, self-control, and moral anchors. By his early 20s, Gerald was no longer merely drifting. He was searching, not for purpose, not for redemption, but for opportunity. Opportunity to act out what had been building inside him for years. That he carried no weapon. He did not need one. His preferred method, strangulation, required only hands. Hands he always had with him. This choice was not random. Strangulation is intimate. It requires proximity, eye contact, physical closeness. It allows the offender to feel the victim's struggle. To watch consciousness fade. For someone obsessed with control, this method is deeply appealing. The first time Gerald killed, it did not feel real. It felt dreamlike, surreal. That he later described a sense of calm afterward. Not panic, not horror. Calm. Relief. If a pressure valve inside him had been released, that reaction sealed his fate. Because once violence becomes a source of relief, it becomes a coping mechanism. And coping mechanisms are repeated. Soon, Gerald began living a double life. Outwardly, he was a nobody. A drifter. A man without history. Inwardly, he was discovering an identity: predator, controller, killer. The boy shaped by silence and cruelty had grown into a man who would inflict silence and cruelty on others, and this was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Making of a Predator. Predators are not born fully formed. They are assembled, slowly, piece by piece, from experiences, beliefs, resentments, fantasies, and failures. By the time Gerald Eugene Stano reached his mid-20s, the components of his personality had fused into something new. Not a confused drifter anymore. Not just a troubled man, but an emerging predator from the outside. Nothing about Gerald stood out. That he did not look threatening, that he was not physically imposing, that he did not carry himself with confidence. If anything, he appeared meek, awkward, forgettable. This unremarkable exterior was one of his greatest advantages. People rarely fear what looks ordinary. Gerald continued moving between cities along Florida's highways. He lived in cheap motels when he had money, slept in his car when he did not. Occasionally stayed in shelters. He survived on a patchwork of temporary jobs and government assistance. This rootless lifestyle gave him freedom. A landlord who knew him well, co-workers who tracked his routines, neighbors who noticed patterns, that he could appear, disappear, reappear somewhere else, and no one would ask questions. Inside, however, his life had become highly structured, not around work, not around relationships, but around fantasy and compulsion. His days revolved around finding sexual material, replaying violent scenarios in his mind, cruising areas where vulnerable women were likely to be found. These activities were no longer occasional. They were central. The fantasies themselves were evolving. Early fantasies had focused on coercion. Later ones focused on domination. Now, they focused on annihilation. In his imagination, women were not just forced into submission. They were erased, rendered powerless forever. This progression reflects a psychological phenomenon known as escalation. What once produced arousal eventually becomes insufficient. The brain adapts. It seeks stronger stimuli. For Gerald, killing had become the ultimate fantasy, but fantasy alone was no longer enough. He wanted to feel it, smell it, hear it, experience it with all senses. The urge to turn imagination into reality grew stronger with each passing month. Gerald also began refining his approach to victims. He learned through trial and error which stories worked, which did not. Claiming his car had broken down often succeeded. Pretending to be injured sometimes worked. Asking for help locating an address worked better than directly asking for a ride. He learned to keep his tone soft, non-threatening, almost timid. People are more likely to help those who appear helpless. Gerald weaponized helplessness. He studied reactions. If a woman looked uneasy, he disengaged. If she seemed sympathetic, he leaned in. He did not rush. He did not force, at least not at first. This patience made him more dangerous, because he appeared safe. Once he had a woman isolated, inside his car, in a secluded area, or in her own space, his demeanor changed. The shy act dropped. The real Gerald emerged, cold, focused, predatory. His primary method was strangulation, hands around the throat, pressure applied steadily, not in a sudden burst, but controlled, calculated. Strangulation provides a unique kind of power. It allows the killer to feel life slipping away. To decide exactly when it ends. This sense of absolute control was what Gerald craved most. He often sexually assaulted victims before killing them, sometimes after, sometimes both. The order mattered less than the experience of dominance. He did not kill out of rage in the traditional sense. That he killed for gratification. This distinction is crucial. Rage-fueled violence is chaotic. Gratification-driven violence is methodical. Gerald was methodical. That he disposed of bodies in remote locations. wooded areas, canals, abandoned properties. Places unlikely to be visited frequently that he did not bury deeply. He did not attempt elaborate concealment. He relied on geography and on society's tendency to overlook the marginalized. Many of his victims were women living on the fringes of society, sex workers, runaways, hitchhikers, women without strong support systems. Their disappearances did not always generate immediate, large-scale searches. This was not an accident. Gerald consciously chose victims he believed would be missed less. This belief reveals a disturbing awareness of social inequality. He understood that some lives are treated as more valuable than others, and he exploited that reality. Each successful murder reinforced a growing sense of invincibility that he began to believe he was smarter than police, smarter than society, smarter than his victims. This grandiosity compensated for lifelong feelings of inferiority that in his mind. He had transformed from nothing into something powerful, from invisible to omnipotent. The contrast was intoxicating. Yet, despite his growing body count, Gerald remained deeply insecure. This is a paradox common among serial offenders. They crave power because they feel powerless. They seek dominance because they feel inferior. Their violence is an attempt to rewrite their identity. Gerald's internal narrative shifted. He no longer saw himself as a loser. He saw himself as a hunter, a controller of fate, someone who decided who deserved to live. This belief system allowed him to justify his actions. That he told himself that his victims were worthless, that they were already broken, that he was doing society a favor. These justifications were not coherent philosophies. They were emotional shields, tools to protect himself from guilt. Notably, Gerald did not experience traditional remorse. That he did not lie awake haunted by faces. He did not feel sorrow for families. He occasionally expressed fear of being caught. But fear is not remorse. Fear is self-centered. Remorse is other-centered. Gerald's emotional world revolved almost entirely around himself. During this period, law enforcement agencies across Florida were dealing with an increasing number of missing women. Cases were scattered across jurisdictions, different counties, different cities, different police departments. There was no central database linking disappearances in an efficient way to identify patterns. This lack of coordination created blind spots. Blind spots Gerald unknowingly exploited. He did not study police procedures. He did not follow true crime news. He succeeded largely by accident, by existing in the cracks of a fragmented system. To neighbors, motel clerks, and casual acquaintances, Gerald remained unremarkable. A quiet man. A loner, sometimes. Odd, but not alarming. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. Monsters do not always look monstrous. Often, they look like nothing at all. Inside Gerald, however, the predator identity was solidifying. Killing was no longer an experiment. It was becoming a routine. A habit, an integral part of his life. The frequency of his offenses increased. The intervals between killings shortened. The compulsion grew stronger. He was no longer killing only when opportunity presented itself. That he was actively seeking opportunity. This shift, from opportunistic offender to proactive hunter, marks a critical stage in the making of a serial killer. It means the behavior is now central to identity, not a deviation, but a purpose. Gerald Eugene Stano had found his dark purpose, and the roads of Florida would soon become, unknowingly, the hunting grounds for one of the most prolific killers in American history. By the time Gerald Eugene Stano realized he could kill and continue living as if nothing had happened, a psychological door had closed behind him, not slammed, not locked, but quietly shut. That on the other side of that door were ordinary moral restraints, empathy, guilt, fear of crossing irreversible lines. Gerald stepped away from that side without looking back. Killing did not feel like a dramatic transformation. It felt like an extension of who he already was becoming. Another behavior, another routine, another way to cope that he structured his life around his urges that he woke with them, carried them through the day, fell asleep thinking about them. When the pressure built too high, he went looking. This pressure is often described by offenders as a kind of internal tension, a restlessness and agitation that does not subside until acted upon. For Gerald, killing was not just pleasure. It was released. He began planning in simple but effective ways. He chose areas where people passed through, places where no one knew anyone well, truck stops, rest areas, small roadside towns that he avoided staying too long in one place. If he sensed even mild suspicion from someone, he left. He trusted his instincts. Those instincts had kept him alive through a chaotic childhood. Now, they guided him in darker pursuits. Gerald also learned how to manage appearances after a killing. That he did not celebrate, he did not talk, he did not change his behavior dramatically. He blended back into his usual routines, watching television in motel rooms, eating cheap fast food, driving aimlessly. This emotional flatness served him well. People tend to associate guilt with visible distress, but many serial offenders experience no visible distress. Their internal worlds operate differently. They compartmentalize. They place violent acts in one mental box, daily life in another. The boxes rarely intersect. This compartmentalization allowed Gerald to function, not well, not productively, but sufficiently. He continued committing minor crimes, shoplifting, petty theft, occasional fraud. These offenses reinforced his sense of being above rules. He was breaking laws regularly and still walking free. Why would murder be any different? The more crimes he committed without consequence, the more his confidence grew. Confidence, in this context, did not look like swagger. It looked like quiet certainty. Certainty that he would not be stopped. Certainty that he was untouchable. This belief is common among serial killers. It often precedes mistakes. But Gerald managed to avoid major mistakes for longer than most. Part of this was luck. Part of it was victim selection. Part of it was systemic failure. And part of it was Gerald's own cautious nature. He did not use his real name with victims. He did not maintain relationships. He did not keep souvenirs. He did not revisit crime scenes. He did not contact police to taunt them. He did not crave notoriety. This last point is important. Many serial killers desire recognition. They want to be known. They want their crimes to be discovered. Gerald did not. He wanted anonymity. Anonymity preserved his power. That if no one knew what he was doing, he could keep doing it. His motivation was internal, not performative. This made him harder to detect. As his body count increased, Gerald began experiencing what some psychologists describe as emotional dulling. Early killings produced intense excitement. Later ones produced less. The brain adapts. Even to extreme stimuli. To achieve the same effect, offenders often escalate. They kill more frequently. They become more violent. They seek new variations. That Gerald's killings became more efficient, less hesitation, less internal conflict. That he knew exactly what he wanted to do. And he did it. He also began to feel a strange sense of ownership over his victims. Not in a sentimental way, but in a possessive way. They were his. Their lives ended because he chose it. This reinforced his grandiose self-image. He was not just a man, he was a force. In rare moments, cracks appeared. Brief flashes of anxiety, a sudden fear when he saw a police car, a moment of panic when someone looked at him too closely. But these moments passed quickly. He reassured himself with evidence. I've done this before. Nothing happened. I'm fine. This self-talk became a mantra that IT kept him going. Meanwhile, families across Florida were beginning to notice. Loved ones were not coming home. Mothers waiting for daughters who never arrived. Friends expecting phone calls that never came. Employers marking workers absent. Missing person reports were filed. Flyers were posted. But each case existed in isolation. One woman gone in one county. Another gone in another. No obvious connections. No obvious suspect. The true scale of what was happening remained hidden. Gerald sometimes followed news reports about missing women, not obsessively, not with excitement, more with detached curiosity. He wanted to see if anything connected to him, if his name appeared, if any details matched his actions. When nothing did, he felt reassured. The system, in his mind, was broken, and broken systems can be exploited. Despite his crimes, Gerald's life remained bleak. He was not happy, he was not fulfilled. Killing did not bring lasting satisfaction. That IT brought temporary relief. Then emptiness returned. This cycle is characteristic of compulsive behavior. The act solves nothing. That IT only perpetuates itself. Gerald did not see this as a problem, that he saw it as reality. This is who I am. This is what I do. He did not imagine a future beyond his current pattern. No long-term goals, no dreams, no desire for change. His life existed in a narrow tunnel of immediate urges and immediate relief. That as time passed, the risk around him slowly increased. Law enforcement agencies were becoming more aware of serial patterns. Task forces were forming. Information sharing, while still limited, was improving. Gerald was unaware of these shifts. He continued operating as he always had, confident, careful, predatory. But no predator remains hidden forever. Eventually, chance, mistake, or coincidence creates a crack. And through that crack, the truth begins to leak. Gerald Eugene Stano had built himself into a predator. Soon, the world would begin to see what he truly was. Chapter 4. The First Kill. Every long journey into darkness has a beginning. Not always a clear one, not always a single moment that can be circled on a calendar and labeled. But there is always a point where a human being crosses from imagining violence to committing it. For Gerald Eugene Stano, that crossing did not feel like stepping off a cliff. That IT felt like drifting across a shallow stream. One step, then another, until suddenly he was on the other side. And nothing felt the same. By the mid-1970s. Gerald had already committed sexual assaults. He had already violated boundaries. He had already discovered that dominating another person brought him a sense of power he had never known. But something inside him remained unsatisfied. The assaults calmed him temporarily. Then the agitation returned, stronger, more insistent. His fantasies had grown darker. They no longer ended with submission. They ended with silence. In his mind. Silence represented completion, finality, total control. The urge to kill was no longer abstract. That IT was specific, focused, persistent. Gerald did not set out one morning with a conscious plan to become a murderer. He did not pack a weapon or write a manifesto. He simply went looking for opportunity. That he drove through areas where he knew vulnerable women could be found. Truck stops, rest areas, roadside diners. Places where strangers crossed paths and rarely asked questions. On one such day, he encountered a young woman traveling alone. Her name, in historical records, is uncertain. Some of Gerald's earliest victims were never identified. Their stories exist only through fragments and Gerald's later confessions. What is known is that she appeared tired, possibly stranded, possibly hitchhiking. Gerald approached her using one of his rehearsed stories. That he claimed he was lost, or that he needed directions, or that his car had trouble. The exact details varied depending on which confession is examined. What does not vary is the outcome. She agreed to get into his C.A. or A.T. that moment. Nothing irreversible had happened. People give rides to strangers every day. Most rides end uneventfully. But inside Gerald's mind, something had already shifted. He was no longer simply hoping for sexual contact. He was considering something far worse than as they drove. Gerald made small talk, neutral, bland, that he asked where she was going. She answered that he nodded. He kept his voice calm, his hands steady. Outwardly, he appeared like an awkward man offering help. Inwardly, he felt a rising tension, not anxiety, anticipation. His heart rate increased. His thoughts narrowed. The world outside the car faded. There was only him and her. At some point, Gerald turned off onto a quieter road. He claimed it was a shortcut, or that he needed to stop for something. She may have questioned it. She may not have. Many victims later described feeling uneasy but unsure why. Human intuition often senses danger before the conscious mind can articulate it to be. By the time she realized something was wrong, Gerald had already decided what he was going to do. He stopped the car in a secluded area. The moment that followed was likely chaotic: confusion, resistance, panic. Gerald did not recall every detail clearly, but he remembered the sensation, the struggle, the physicality. He placed his hands around her throat, squeezed, not instantly, not brutally, gradually, controlled. That he felt her body tense. Her hands clawed his arms, her breathing become erratic. He did not stop. In that moment, Gerald was not thinking about consequences. He was not thinking about prison. He was not thinking about morality. He was experiencing something he had fantasized about for years. Total power. He watched her eyes. He watched her face changed. He felt her strength fade. And then, eventually, she went still. Silence. The silence he had imagined. For a few seconds, Gerald remained frozen. Not in horror, not in regret, but in shock. Not because he was appalled by what he had done, but because he had done it. The line he had imagined crossing for so long was now behind him. He had killed someone. The realization did not come with overwhelming guilt. It came with a strange calm, a sense of completion, as if something that had been building inside him had finally discharged. He checked her body. No movement, no breathing. She was dead. Gerald had expected to feel something dramatic, a rush, a crash, tears. Instead, he felt empty, but not in a painful way. More like a pressure had been released. He then faced a practical problem. What to do with the body? This moment is often where inexperienced defenders make mistakes. They panic. They call attention to themselves. They leave evidence. Gerald, however, did something simpler. He dragged her body into nearby vegetation, away from the road, out of immediate sight. He did not bury her. He did not attempt to clean extensively. He relied on isolation and on chance that he returned to his car, sat behind the wheel, and drove away. No one stopped him. No police sirens, no roadblocks, no witnesses. Life continued. This lack of immediate consequence had a profound psychological effect. It confirmed a belief that was already forming. I can do this, and nothing will happen. In the hours and days that followed, Gerald did not turn himself in. He did not confide in anyone. He did not collapse under guilt. He went back to his usual routines: eating cheap food, driving, watching television, sleeping. The normalcy of life after murder disturbed him less than one might expect, because his internal world had already been abnormal for a long time. Killing did not feel like a radical departure. It felt like the next logical step in an ongoing pattern. The first kill did not haunt him. It validated him. It proved that he could turn fantasy into reality. It proved that he was capable of ultimate control. It proved that he was not as weak as he had always believed. These conclusions were deeply flawed, but they became foundational to his identity. He did not think of himself as a murderer in a moral sense, that he thought of himself as someone who took what he wanted, someone who did not have to follow rules, someone who was finally powerful. This is how serial killers are born, not in a single explosion of evil, but in a quiet moment of discovery. A realization that violence feels good. A realization that consequences are not immediate. A realization that the door, once opened, does not easily close. Gerald Eugene Stano had taken his first life, and he would not stop. After the first kill, Gerald Eugene Stano expected something to change, not necessarily in the world, but inside himself. That he expected to feel different, transformed, marked. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing inside him shifted in the way popular culture often portrays. He did not feel cursed. He did not feel haunted. He did not feel redeemed. That he felt normal. That normality was the most dangerous development of all, because when something as extreme as murder begins to feel ordinary, it loses its psychological barrier. It becomes an option. A tool. A solution. Gerald replayed the experience in his mind, not the fear on the woman's face, not the suffering, but the sensation of control, the moment when resistance stopped, the stillness afterward. That he focused on what he liked, not on what he had destroyed. This selective memory reinforced his desire to repeat the experience. The first kill had taught him several important lessons: that he could overpower a woman, that he could kill without witnesses, that he could leave a body and walk away, that he could live with it. These lessons lowered his internal inhibitions. Before, killing had existed only in fantasy. Now, it existed as proven reality. The barrier between thought and action had been broken, and once broken, it does not repair itself. Gerald did not immediately set out to kill again, not because he felt remorse, but because the internal pressure had temporarily subsided. Like an addiction, the urge quieted after being satisfied. But, as with all addictions, the quiet did not last. Over time, his fantasies returned, stronger, more vivid. Now, they were informed by memory. He could recall how it felt. He could imagine variations, different settings, different victims, different methods. Fantasy and memory blended. This made the urge more compelling than before. The first kill had also reshaped Gerald's self-image. He no longer saw himself solely as a rejected, powerless man. That he saw himself as someone capable of decisive, irreversible action. This gave him a twisted sense of confidence. Confidence not rooted in competence or achievement, but in the ability to destroy. Destructive confidence is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement. To maintain this new identity, Gerald needed to repeat the behavior, not consciously, not in a logical, step-by-step way, but psychologically. Killing had become part of who he was. He began once again cruising areas where vulnerable women might be found. This time, he was not just curious, he was hunting. The second murder came more easily than the first. There was less hesitation, less internal debate. That he approached another woman using a familiar story. She got into his car. He drove to a secluded area. That he strangled her. He left her body. The sequence was nearly identical. The simplicity disturbed even him. On some level, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt easy. Each repetition made the act more automatic, more efficient, more routine. This is a hallmark of serial offending. The behavior shifts from extraordinary to habitual. Like any habit, it becomes embedded in daily life. Gerald did not mark anniversaries. He did not keep track of numbers. He did not write anything down. But internally, he knew he was doing something significant. Not morally significant, but personally significant, that he had found his role in a world where he had always felt like a failure. He had found something he could do successfully. That realization is deeply unsettling, but it explains much about his persistence. He was not trying to become famous, he was not trying to send a message, he was fulfilling an internal need. His victims were interchangeable in his mind. They were not individuals. They were functions. Each represented an opportunity to achieve the same psychological outcome: control, release, reaffirmation of identity. As the months passed, Gerald's killings increased in frequency. The intervals between them shortened. What once required weeks of buildup now required days, sometimes hours. This acceleration is common in serial offenders. The brain becomes conditioned to expect the reward. When it is delayed, discomfort increases. Killing becomes not just desirable, but necessary. Gerald also grew more confident in his ability to avoid detection. He had killed multiple times. Nothing had happened. No police questioning. No suspicious encounters. No near misses. This reinforced a dangerous belief that I am invisible, that I am smarter than everyone, that I will never be caught. This belief made him careless in subtle ways, not enough to draw immediate attention, but enough to slowly increase risk. He did not suddenly start killing in crowded places. He did not drastically change his methods, but he became less cautious about where he operated, that he stayed in areas longer, that he repeated patterns. These small changes would eventually matter, but at this stage, they went unnoticed to the outside world. Gerald remained a drifter, a nobody, another transient face among thousands. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies were beginning to notice an unsettling trend. Women were disappearing. Not in one concentrated area, but across multiple counties. Some bodies were found. Many were not. The cases did not yet point clearly to a single offender, but a vague sense of something larger was forming. Gerald had no awareness of this. He did not track police activity. He did not analyze patterns. He relied entirely on his past success. Past success breeds overconfidence. Overconfidence breeds mistakes, but before mistakes came more victims, more lives erased, more families left without answers. Gerald did not see those families. He did not imagine their grief. He did not care. In his psychological universe, only one person existed: himself. The first kill had not been an anomaly. It had been an initiation. A threshold. On the other side of that threshold waited a future defined by repetition. And Gerald Eugene Stano walked into that future willingly. Chapter 5. A Drifter in Plain Sight. To understand how Gerald Eugene Stano was able to kill again and again without being stopped, one must first understand how thoroughly he blended into the background of American life. He did not lurk in shadows. He did not stalk alleyways in a trench coat. He did not stand out. That he existed in the open: gas stations, diners, motels, rest areas, bus terminals. Places designed for people who are passing through. Places where no one asks personal questions. Places where anonymity is normal. Gerald built his life inside this anonymity. His appearance worked in his favor. Average height, thin, unremarkable face, distinctive scars, memorable hairstyle. But if 10 people passed him on the street, 9 would forget him seconds later. This forgettability became one of his most powerful tools. Witnesses might recall speaking to a guy. Not a name. Not a clear description, just a vague memory of someone who seemed awkward but harmless. Gerald leaned into this. He dressed plainly. Cheap jeans, t-shirts, worn sneakers. Nothing that suggested wealth. Nothing that suggested authority. Nothing that suggested danger. People tend to fear what looks powerful. They often underestimate what looks weak. Gerald understood this instinctively, that he cultivated an image of mild incompetence, that he appeared socially clumsy, soft-spoken, sometimes nervous. This disarmed people. It made him seem non-threatening, that if he stumbled over words or avoided eye contact, it did not raise alarm. That it made him appear shy, harmless, someone who might need help rather than pose danger. This performance was not theatrical. It was natural. Gerald had spent his entire life feeling awkward and inferior. Now, he weaponized those traits. He drifted along major highways, especially through Florida. The state's geography offered endless opportunities, long stretches of road, tourist, traffic, seasonal workers, runaways, hitchhikers, people constantly moving, people constantly disappearing. That he favored small towns and roadside communities, places with limited police resources, places where officers handled everything from traffic accidents to domestic disputes to missing persons. Overworked, understaffed, cases piled up, details blurred. Gerald did not research these vulnerabilities. That he benefited from them instinctively. His days followed a loose rhythm. Wake up in a motel or car. Eat something cheap. Drive. Stop at gas stations. Walk around. Observe. Sometimes he would spend hours doing nothing in particular. Sitting, watching people come and go. Waiting for an internal feeling. A signal. When the urge rose, he became more alert, more focused. His attention narrowed. He scanned for women who looked alone, women who seemed tired, women who appeared uncertain. He did not target women who were with others. He did not target groups. He did not want confrontation. He wanted control. Approach was always slow, non-threatening. He might ask for directions. He might comment on the weather. He might mention car trouble. He did not rush into requests. He let conversation build. If a woman responded positively, he continued. If she seemed uncomfortable, he backed off. This selectivity reduced his risk. It also reinforced his sense of competence. He believed he was skilled, clever. In reality, he was exploiting basic human kindness. Most people want to help. Most people do not assume the worst. Gerald counted on this. Once he had a woman in his car, the dynamic changed. The enclosed space gave him advantage. He controlled the destination. He controlled the speed. He controlled when and where the car stopped. From that moment on, the situation belonged to him. He often drove to secluded areas he had previously noticed. Empty lots, wooded turnoffs, abandoned buildings, canals. He did not need elaborate planning, just privacy. The act itself followed a familiar pattern: restraint, strangulation, sexual assault, silence. He did not always follow the same order, but the components remained. Afterward, he moved on. He did not linger. He did not return to check bodies. He did not revisit locations. He drove away and blended back into traffic. This ability to compartmentalize allowed him to function. He could kill in the afternoon, eat dinner in the evening, watch television at night, sleep, wake up. Repeat. To an outsider, his life looked empty. To him, it felt purposeful. Killing gave his days structure, something to look forward to, something to plan around. This is one of the most disturbing aspects of serial offending. Violence becomes routine, not an outburst, not a breakdown. A routine. Gerald also used multiple aliases. Sometimes he gave fake names. Sometimes he gave no name at all. He rarely stayed in one place long enough for anyone to know him well. Motel clerks might remember him as a quiet guest. Gas station attendants might recall selling him cigarettes. But no one built a profile. No one connected dots. Because there were no obvious dots to connect, he did not brag. He did not confide. He did not display trophies. He did not take photographs. He did not keep diaries. His crimes existed only in his mind, and in the places where he left bodies. Law enforcement's lack of coordination at the time further protected him. Different counties handled their own cases. Information sharing was limited. If a woman disappeared in one county and another disappeared 2 counties away, there was no immediate system linking them. Patterns that seem obvious in hindsight were invisible in real time. That Gerald's victims were often marginalized: sex workers, runaways, women with unstable housing, people whose routines were already irregular. When such individuals disappear, it may take days or weeks before anyone notices, sometimes longer. This delay gives killers crucial time. Time to move, time to create distance, time to blur memory. Gerald exploited this without necessarily articulating it. He simply chose victims who were easier to isolate, easier to lure, less likely to generate immediate search efforts. To Gerald, this was practical, not strategic in an intellectual sense, but instinctively practical. That AS months turned into years. Gerald's body count grew. Quietly, invisibly, he did not mark milestones. He did not reflect. He did not see himself as part of history. He saw himself as surviving, thriving, in his own distorted way. That he remained a drifter in plain sight, passing through towns where families lived ordinary lives, where children rode bikes, where people went to work and came home. None of them aware that a serial killer was buying gas down the street, eating at the same diners, sleeping in nearby motels. This proximity between normal life and extreme violence is deeply unsettling. It reminds us that monsters do not exist only in distant, cinematic spaces. They exist among us, unremarkable, forgettable, hidden in plain sight. As Gerald Eugene Stano continued drifting through Florida, something subtle began to change. Not in how he killed, not in how he approached victims, but in how he thought about himself. The more he succeeded, the more he internalized a new identity. Not just someone who kills, but someone who is good at killing. This belief did not manifest as loud arrogance. That it manifested as quiet certainty, that a steady conviction that he was operating on a different level than everyone else. That he began to view ordinary people as simple, predictable, easy to manipulate. This sense of superiority compensated for his lifelong feelings of inferiority. For the first time, he felt ahead of the world instead of behind it. That psychological shift is crucial, because when an offender sees himself as superior, moral rules lose relevance. Rules are for others, not for him. Gerald also began refining small details of his routine. He learned which areas were more secluded at certain times of day, which roads were rarely traveled, which rest stops were poorly lit. These observations were not part of a master plan. They were accumulated through repetition, through experience, through trial and error. He did not need sophistication. He needed consistency. Gerald's lack of sophistication, in fact, worked in his favor. He did not overthink. He did not attempt complex schemes. That he kept things simple. Simple methods are harder to detect than elaborate ones. Simple methods leave fewer unique signatures. This meant his crimes looked generic: strangulation, sexual assault, bodies left in remote locations. These elements, sadly, were common among violent crimes of the era. Nothing immediately distinguished his cases from countless others. Another factor that protected Gerald was his lack of emotional display. He did not show visible excitement after killings. He did not become hyperactive. He did not dramatically change his behavior. This made him appear stable, even boring. People tend to associate dangerous individuals with volatility, anger, outbursts, erratic behavior. Gerald exhibited none of these publicly. He was quiet, withdrawn, flat. This emotional flatness was misinterpreted as harmlessness to in reality. It reflected profound emotional detachment. Gerald occasionally encountered law enforcement for minor issues, traffic stops, loitering, petty theft. Each time, he complied, answered questions briefly, appeared cooperative. Officers saw nothing extraordinary, just another drifter, just another low-level nuisance. These brief interactions reinforced his belief that he could interact with police and remain undetected. This false sense of security made him bolder, not dramatically bolder, but incrementally that he stayed in certain areas longer, that he returned to familiar hunting grounds, that he repeated patterns. Patterns create predictability. Predictability creates risk at the same time. Law enforcement agencies across Florida were slowly accumulating missing person reports. Individually, each case seemed isolated. Collectively, they hinted at something larger. But recognizing that something larger required data, and data systems were primitive. Most records were on paper, filed in cabinets, stored in local offices. Connecting cases across jurisdictions required phone calls, meetings, and human memory. This process was slow, error-prone, inconsistent. Gerald benefited from this institutional lag. He was killing during a transitional era in policing, that era before computerized databases, before national missing persons systems, before routine interagency task forces. He existed in a blind spot. Meanwhile, Gerald's internal world continued narrowing, that he did not develop hobbies, he did not cultivate friendships, he did not pursue education. His life revolved around three things: finding food, finding shelter, finding victims. Everything else was background noise. This narrowing of focus is another hallmark of serial offenders. The behavior becomes central to identity. Other aspects of life wither. The person becomes more one-dimensional. Gerald's thoughts became increasingly repetitive. Fantasies replayed. Scenarios recycled. He was not creative, he was compulsive. This compulsion drove him, not toward innovation, but toward repetition. He did not seek novelty, he sought the same outcome. Again and again and again. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when Gerald sensed that what he was doing might eventually end badly. A sudden fear when he saw police lights, a jolt of anxiety when someone asked too many questions. But these moments passed. He reassured himself with his history, I've done this dozens of times. Nothing happened, I'm fine. This self-reinforcing loop strengthened his denial. Denial is a powerful psychological defense that allows a person to continue harmful behavior without confronting its reality. Gerald did not see himself as part of a growing disaster. He saw himself as managing his life in his mind. He was not destroying society. He was simply satisfying his needs. This self-centered framing is common among predatory offenders. They do not view victims as separate beings with their own lives. They view them as instruments, tools, objects. Gerald's victims became abstract, faces blurred, names irrelevant. He could no longer recall many of them, not because he was traumatized, but because they were interchangeable in his mind. This dehumanization further insulated him from guilt. If victims are not fully human in your mind, harming them does not feel like harming a person. It feels like using an object. This psychological mechanism made continued killing possible as his crimes accumulated. Gerald also began to experience a subtle increase in recklessness. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to matter. He sometimes left bodies closer to roads. He sometimes killed in areas slightly less isolated. He sometimes spoke longer with victims before attacking. These small deviations increased the chances of being seen. He did not recognize this, because his past success blinded him. Success creates the illusion of control. In reality, It often creates vulnerability. Every serial killer eventually makes mistakes, not always dramatic ones. Sometimes tiny ones that a wrong turn, that a chance encounter, that a witness who remembers a face, that a traffic stop at the wrong moment. Gerald's time in the shadows was not infinite. He did not know this. He continued drifting, continued hunting, continued blending into the background, a drifter in plain sight. But the longer he operated, the more likely it became that his invisible trail would intersect with someone who paid attention. And when that happened, everything would change. Chapter 6. The Highway of Broken Lives. Highways are designed to connect places to move people from one destination to another. But for Gerald Eugene Stano, highways became something else entirely. They became corridors of opportunity. Endless ribbons of asphalt stretching through forests, swamps, and small towns. Places where strangers met briefly. Places where no one expected to be remembered. Places where people vanished. As Gerald drove these roads, mile after mile, he began to associate certain stretches of highway with anticipation, not consciously at first, but gradually. Specific exits, specific rest areas, specific clusters of roadside businesses became linked in his mind with past successes. These locations took on a psychological charge. They were no longer just places, they were hunting grounds. Gerald often drove with no clear destination, that he let the road decide, that he followed impulses. If a town felt promising, he stayed. If it did not, he moved on. This aimlessness masked a deeper pattern that he was circling, not geographically, but behaviorally, repeating the same cycle: drive, observe, approach, kill, leave. The highway facilitated this cycle perfectly. It provided anonymity, it provided mobility, it provided escape routes in every direction. After each killing, Gerald could put miles between himself and the crime scene within hours. Distance dilutes suspicion. By the late 1970s, Gerald had likely killed many women. The exact number remains uncertain. He would later confess to dozens. Some estimates place the number even higher. What matters more than the precise figure is the pattern. Women were disappearing along highways and in towns connected by those highways. Some bodies were found. Many were not. Those that were found often showed similar signs: strangulation, sexual assault, dumped in secluded areas. But these similarities were not immediately recognized as part of a single series. Each case was investigated locally. Different detectives, different procedures, different priorities. That Gerald's crimes were spread thin across a wide geographic area. This dispersion made pattern recognition difficult. If he had operated in a single city, he might have been caught sooner. Instead, he used geography as a shield. That he also benefited from the transient nature of many victims: hitchhikers, sex workers, runaways, women without fixed addresses, people who moved frequently. When such individuals disappear, it can be hard to determine when or where it happened. Sometimes families did not know where a loved one had last been seen. Sometimes no one filed a report at all. These gaps created space for Gerald to operate. That he understood, on some level, that certain people were less protected by society. He did not articulate this in moral terms. He simply gravitated toward those who were easier to isolate, easier to lure, easier to erase. Gerald did not view himself as targeting specific types of women based on appearance or personality. His primary criteria were vulnerability and accessibility. That if a woman was alone, if she seemed uncertain, if she engaged with him, she became a potential victim. This opportunistic approach increased his pool of targets. It also made his crimes harder to predict. Some serial killers have very narrow victim profiles. Gerald's was broader, which further complicated investigations. His method remained consistent that he approached with a benign story, that he gained trust, he isolated, that he strangled, he disposed, that he moved on. This consistency created a kind of grim efficiency. He did not experiment much with weapons. He did not vary his approach significantly. This suggests that his primary gratification came from the outcome, not from novelty, not from theatrics, just from control. That on the highways, Gerald often passed ordinary families on vacation, couples heading to visit relatives, truck drivers hauling goods, students traveling between cities. None of them knew they were sharing the road with a serial killer. This ordinariness is one of the most unsettling aspects of his story. Evil did not announce itself. That IT rode quietly in an aging car, stopped for gas, bought snacks, paid cash, and continued on. Gerald sometimes stayed in one area long enough to commit multiple murders before moving on. This created small clusters of cases, but without centralized data, these clusters were rarely recognized as such. Even when detectives noticed similarities, they lacked the ability to easily compare notes with other jurisdictions. Phone calls and letters were the primary means of communication. Information traveled slowly. Criminals moved quickly. Gerald also benefited from his lack of connection to victims. He did not know their families. He did not know their friends. He did not frequent the same social circles. This meant there were no obvious links between him and the missing women. In many cases, investigators did not even know who the victims were. Unidentified remains cannot point to suspects. They cannot describe last known associates. They exist as silent evidence. That Gerald's crimes generated a growing trail of silent evidence. Bodies in ditches, remains in wooded areas, skeletal fragments discovered months or years later. Each discovery represented a tragedy, but also a missed opportunity, because without context, each case remained isolated. Gerald did not follow news obsessively, but he occasionally saw headlines about missing women, sometimes about unidentified bodies. These stories did not disturb him. They reassured him. They told him that his crimes were being interpreted as separate events, not as a unified pattern. This reinforced his belief that he was safe. As he continued traveling, Gerald's internal world grew narrower. He was not building memories in a human sense. He was not accumulating experiences. He was repeating the same one over and over. The highway became both literal and metaphorical. A straight line, N-O turns toward growth, N-O exits toward change. Just forward motion toward more destruction. At times, Gerald experienced brief flashes of boredom, not with killing, but with waiting. Waiting for the urge to rise, waiting for opportunity. This boredom did not lead to reflection. It led to impatience. He began spending more time cruising, more time in areas where he could encounter potential victims. This increased activity increased risk. He did not notice, because he had not been caught. Success breeds complacency. Complacency breeds exposure. But before exposure came more broken lives, more families left wondering, more names never spoken. Again, the highway of broken lives continued to grow longer, and Gerald Eugene Stano kept driving. As the years passed and the miles accumulated, Gerald Eugene Stano began to experience a subtle shift in how he related to the highway. In the beginning, the road had felt like freedom. Freedom from oversight, freedom from responsibility, freedom from attachment. But now, the highway felt more like a circuit. A loop he traveled again and again. The sense of novelty faded. What remained was routine, and routine, even when built around violence, eventually becomes dull. This dullness did not make Gerald stop. It made him restless. Restlessness is dangerous in a predator because it pushes toward more frequent action, more risk-taking, more exposure. Gerald found himself thinking about killing more often. The internal pressure built faster. He had less patience. Where once he might wait weeks between murders, he now felt compelled to act within days, sometimes within hours. This acceleration is a common trajectory in serial offending. The behavior becomes increasingly central to psychological stability. Without it, the offender feels unsettled, irritable, agitated. Gerald did not have language for these states. He simply felt bad, and he knew how to make that feeling go away. He also began to spend more time in familiar areas, towns he had visited before, highways he knew well, places where he felt comfortable. This familiarity reduced anxiety, but it also increased the likelihood of recognition. Even if people did not know him by name, repeated presence increases the chance that someone will remember a face. Gerald did not consider this. He trusted his invisibility. That trust was misplaced as he continued killing. The sheer number of victims began to leave a heavier footprint. Not a single obvious trail, but a growing accumulation of cases. More missing women, more unidentified remains, more reports. Within certain counties, detectives began noticing similarities. Women found strangled, women showing signs of sexual assault, bodies left in remote areas, still without strong evidence linking the cases. These observations remain tentative. Serial killers, at this time, were still often conceptualized as rare anomalies. The idea that one person could be responsible for dozens of murders was difficult for many investigators to accept. Gerald benefited from this cognitive barrier. People tend to underestimate the scale of human capacity for harm. Meanwhile, Gerald's internal justifications hardened that he no longer questioned whether what he was doing was wrong. That question had become irrelevant. He viewed killing as part of his nature, like breathing, like eating, something he did because he was built that way. This belief removed any remaining sense of choice that if I am this way, then I cannot be otherwise. This fatalistic thinking is common among chronic offenders that it absolves them, in their own minds, of responsibility. Gerald also increasingly blamed his victims. He told himself they were foolish for trusting him, that they should have known better, that they were asking for trouble. This victim blaming served an important psychological function that it shifted responsibility outward. If victims are at fault, then the offender is not fully to blame. This distortion made continued violence easier. Gerald's social isolation deepened. He did not maintain contact with family. He did not build friendships. He did not pursue relationships. Human connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability terrified him, because vulnerability reminded him of childhood, of weakness, of being hurt. Killing, by contrast, made him feel invulnerable, untouchable. This contrast reinforced his dependence on violence as an emotional regulator. Occasionally, Gerald attempted to engage in more conventional activities. He might take a temporary job. He might stay in one town for a few weeks. These periods never lasted. Work frustrated him. Authority angered him. Routine bored him. Soon, he returned to the road, returned to hunting, returned to the only activity that gave him a sense of purpose. There were moments when chance nearly exposed him. A woman who refused to get into his car. A bystander who watched him speak with someone. A police officer who briefly questioned him. Each time, nothing came of it. These near misses did not scare him into stopping. They reinforced his sense of skill that he interpreted survival as competence, not luck. This is another common cognitive error among serial offenders. They attribute success to their own abilities. They attribute failure, if it occurs, to external factors. This bias strengthens overconfidence. Overconfidence leads to mistakes. But Gerald was not yet at the stage where mistakes were obvious. He continued operating within a narrow comfort zone. Same approach, same method, same type of locations. The very consistency that had protected him would eventually betray him. Patterns are invisible in small numbers. They become visible as they accumulate. Gerald did not see accumulation, that he saw individual acts. He did not think in terms of total victims, that he thought in terms of the next urge, the next opportunity, the next release. This short-term focus kept him from anticipating long-term consequences. The highway, once a symbol of freedom, had become a closed system. Gerald drove it, killed, drove again, killed again. The circle tightened. Unknown to him, law enforcement agencies were slowly, imperfectly, beginning to share information. Detectives started talking to each other about similarities, about traveling offenders, about the possibility that multiple murders might be connected. These conversations were tentative, but they represented the first cracks in Gerald's invisibility, cracks he could not see, cracks that would widen, cracks that would eventually let light in. Gerald Eugene Stano continued driving, continued hunting, unaware that the highway he believed belonged to him was quietly becoming the path that would lead to his capture. Chapter 7. Voices that went unheard. Every serial killer leaves more behind than bodies. They leave echoes, unanswered phone calls, empty bedrooms, unclaimed belongings, families suspended in uncertainty. For every life Gerald Eugene Stano took, there were people who felt a sudden, unexplainable absence, that a silence where a voice used to be. These silences began accumulating quietly across Florida and beyond. At first, they did not look connected. One woman failed to return home. Another missed a scheduled shift at work. Another never called her parents again. Each disappearance existed as its own tragedy, but together they formed a hidden pattern. Families often noticed something was wrong long before authorities did. At a daughter who never stayed out of contact suddenly vanished. At a sister who always checked and stopped answering calls. That a friend who promised to meet never arrived. These early moments were filled with confusion. People assumed benign explanations. Car trouble, lost phone, decided to travel. Unexpectedly, many families waited days before contacting police. They did not want to overreact. They did not want to believe the worst. That delay, though understandable, gave Gerald valuable time. When missing person reports were filed, they were often met with limited urgency, especially if the missing woman was an adult, especially if she had a history of transient living, especially if she was involved in sex work or had run away before. Officers sometimes suggested that the woman had simply chosen to leave, that she would turn up, that she was probably fine. These assumptions were not born from malice. They were born from systemic biases. Certain lives were treated as less at risk. Certain disappearances were treated as less alarming. That Gerald's victims disproportionately came from these overlooked categories, not because he articulated a theory about social neglect, but because he sensed, instinctively, that these women were less protected, less tracked, less likely to trigger immediate, intensive searches. Families who pushed harder sometimes encountered resistance, limited resources, other priorities, overworked departments. Missing person cases compete with countless other demands. Without clear evidence of foul play, they often stagnated. Flyers were printed, photos were posted on bulletin boards, phone calls were made, but leads were scarce. In many cases, there were no witnesses. Known last contacts, clear timeline. The women had simply vanished. Some families organized their own searches, walking through wooded areas, checking hospitals, calling shelters, visiting morgues. These searches were emotionally exhausting and usually fruitless. The lack of answers created a unique kind of suffering, not grief, not closure, but limbo. A state where hope and despair coexist. where every phone call could be the one, that where every unknown body found could be theirs. This limbo can last years, decades, sometimes a lifetime. Gerald never saw this suffering, that he never stood in a mother's living room, filled with unanswered questions, that he never spoke to siblings searching for explanations, that he never witnessed children growing up without knowing what happened to their parent. These human consequences did not exist in his mental universe. His victims ended at the moment he left their bodies. Everything beyond that moment was invisible to him. Some of Gerald's victims were eventually found, often by chance, that a hunter discovering remains in the woods, that a construction crew uncovering bones, that a fisherman spotting something unusual near a canal. These discoveries triggered brief surges of investigative activity. Autopsies were performed. Cause of death was determined when possible: strangulation, signs of sexual assault. Sometimes, identification was impossible. Bodies had decomposed too much, that no dental records available, no missing person report that clearly matched. These women became Jane Does. Anonymous in death, anonymous in life. Even when remains were identified, cases often stalled. There were no obvious suspects, no witnesses, to no crime scenes with recoverable evidence. The passage of time destroyed physical clues. Weather, animals, human activity, all degrade evidence. Gerald's habit of leaving bodies exposed but remote meant that nature did much of the work of concealment. Families were sometimes notified years after a disappearance that remains had been found. This did not always bring closure. Sometimes it raised more questions. Where had she been all that time? What happened to her? Who did this? Questions with no answers. Communities occasionally sensed something was wrong. Rumors circulated. People whispered about a killer on the loose. But without clear information, these fears remained vague. Urban legends, speculation. Not enough to change behavior in a sustained way. Women continued hitchhiking, continued walking alone, continued trusting strangers, not because they were careless, but because daily life requires a certain level of trust to function. Society cannot operate if everyone assumes everyone else is a murderer. Gerald exploited this basic social necessity, that he relied on people's default assumption of safety. Law enforcement agencies did attempt to connect cases. Some detectives noticed similarities: strangulation, sexual assault, remote dump sites. But similarities alone do not prove a single offender, especially in a large state with a high volume of violent crime. Different killers can use similar methods, without a suspect, without forensic links. The idea of a single traveling killer remained speculative. Meanwhile, families continued to wait. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. Empty chairs at dinner tables became permanent. Some families refused to give up hope. They kept rooms unchanged. They celebrated birthdays for missing loved ones. They held on to the possibility of reunion. Others gradually accepted that their loved one was likely dead. But acceptance without answers is not peace. It is resignation. Gerald did not know the names of most of his victims. He did not care to know. But their names existed. They had identities, histories, dreams, relationships. Each life had meaning beyond the moment Gerald took it. That meaning persisted, even if he never acknowledged it. The phrase, "voices that went unheard," is not metaphorical. These women did speak. They told friends about plans. They told families where they were going. They expressed fears. They asked for help at times in their lives. But in critical moments, their voices did not reach anyone who could save them. Not because no one cared, but because systems failed, because resources were limited, because patterns were hard to see, because predators like Gerald thrived in gaps. Understanding this does not diminish Gerald's responsibility. He alone chose to kill, but he alone committed the acts. But it does highlight a painful truth. Serial killers do not operate in a vacuum. They operate within social contexts, within systemic weaknesses, within blind spots. The suffering left behind by Gerald Eugene Stano cannot be measured solely by a body count. It must be measured in decades of unanswered questions. In families permanently altered. In children who grew up without parents. In parents who died without knowing what happened to their daughters. These are the invisible casualties, the ones not listed in statistics, the ones who carry the weight long after headlines fade. Gerald drove on, killed again, and somewhere, another family began waiting. While families searched and communities whispered, Gerald Eugene Stano continued moving through Florida as though untouched by consequence. He did not feel the tremors his actions were sending outward. He did not imagine candlelight vigils. He did not picture detectives sitting at desks late at night, reviewing case files with growing unease. In his world, each murder ended when he drove away. In reality, each one began a chain reaction. As more women disappeared, a subtle shift began inside certain law enforcement offices. Individually, cases still seemed isolated, but experienced detectives develop instincts. Patterns whisper before they shout. Some investigators began noticing that several strangulation cases shared similarities. Remote dump sites, victims found partially clothed, evidence of sexual assault, and most strikingly, a lack of clear suspects. Still, connecting these dots required communication across jurisdictions. Counties needed to compare notes. Photographs needed to be mailed. Reports needed to be copied and shared. This process was slow and inconsistent, but it had started. Gerald, unaware of these developments, maintained his routine: drive, observe, approach, isolate, kill, leave. Yet something else was shifting. The sheer number of missing women was becoming harder to ignore. Local newspapers occasionally ran short articles about disappearances. Small columns buried between advertisements and local sports scores. A photo. A brief description. A request for information. Most readers skimmed past them, but for families, those columns were lifelines, proof that their loved one had not been forgotten entirely. Some families began connecting with one another through community networks, through churches, through advocacy groups. They noticed similarities in their stories. Young women disappearing along highways, strangulation suspected in some cases, remote locations. These informal networks sometimes moved faster than official channels. Shared grief created connection. Connection created awareness. Awareness slowly built pressure. Pressure on law enforcement to look deeper. Gerald did not perceive this rising pressure. He operated on immediate feedback. Had he been questioned? No. Had he been arrested? No. Then, in his mind, everything was fine. This short-term thinking blinded him to long-term risk. Meanwhile, investigators were gradually refining their understanding of serial crime. Profiling techniques were becoming more widely discussed. The idea that a single offender might travel between jurisdictions was gaining acceptance. The term serial killer itself was entering public vocabulary more frequently. Although Gerald did not seek notoriety, he existed within this evolving landscape. As detectives compared notes, they began to consider the possibility of a traveling offender targeting vulnerable women. Descriptions of last known contacts were vague, often just a man, sometimes a white male, occasionally a guy in a car. These fragments were frustratingly incomplete, but they were fragments nonetheless. Gerald's invisibility was beginning to fray at the edges. There were also survivors, women who encountered him but escaped, women who felt uneasy and declined a ride, women who left his presence before he could isolate them. Some later recalled feeling that something was wrong, that his demeanor shifted subtly. that his eyes seemed different once they were alone. These accounts, when shared, added texture to the growing suspicion that someone was preying on women along the highways. Still, suspicion is not evidence, and without evidence, investigation stalled. Gerald's lack of distinctive behavior continued to shield him. He did not use the same car for years, that he changed vehicles when necessary. He did not remain in one location long enough to build a reputation. He did not commit crimes in front of witnesses. He avoided confrontation whenever possible. This caution delayed his exposure, but it could not prevent it indefinitely. The accumulation of cases was creating momentum. Momentum in policing, momentum in public awareness, momentum in media attention. Gradually, reports began referencing the possibility of connected cases. Speculation appeared in headlines, not definitive statements, but questions. Could these murders be linked? Is there a pattern? Is someone targeting women along Florida highways? Such questions, once printed, alter public perception. They create vigilance. They create caution. Women began warning each other more frequently about accepting rides from strangers. Families became more insistent about knowing travel plans. The culture of unquestioned trust began to shift. This shift reduced opportunities for Gerald. Not immediately, but gradually. More women hesitated. More declined rides. More trusted their instincts. Gerald noticed this on some level, that he sensed that it was slightly harder to lure victims. But he interpreted this as individual resistance, not as a broader cultural shift. His focus remained narrow. The next opportunity, the next urge, the next act. Meanwhile, families continued living in limbo. Some held memorial services without bodies. Some kept filing missing person updates year after year. Some contacted media outlets repeatedly, hoping to keep stories alive. The emotional toll was immense. Grief mixed with uncertainty can fracture families. Arguments over what to believe, whether to hope, whether to mourn. Gerald's actions rippled through generations. Children grew up without mothers. Parents aged without answers. Siblings carried unresolved trauma. The phrase "voices that went unheard" extended beyond the victims themselves. It included families whose pleas were delayed by bureaucracy, whose warnings were not immediately recognized as part of something larger. As this chapter of Gerald's life progressed, two parallel forces were strengthening: his compulsion to kill and the investigative effort to stop whoever was responsible. These forces were moving toward each other, slowly, inevitably. Gerald believed he controlled his destiny, that he believed the highway belonged to him. He believed invisibility was permanent. He was wrong. The voices that went unheard were gathering, and soon they would be amplified in a way he never anticipated. Chapter 8. Patterns in the darkness. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They emerge quietly, from repetition, from accumulation, from details that, alone, seem meaningless, but together begin to form a shape. By the late 1970s, that shape was slowly taking form across Florida. It was not yet clear, not yet defined, but it was there. Women were disappearing. Some were being found dead, strangled, sexually assaulted, left in remote locations. These facts existed in case files scattered across counties. Different detectives, different filing systems, different priorities. But human curiosity has a way of pushing against isolation. Detectives talk. They share frustrations. They compare notes informally, sometimes over phone calls, sometimes at conferences, sometimes in quiet conversations between colleagues who sense that something larger is unfolding. It was through these informal channels that the first whispers of connection began to circulate. Not certainty, not proof, but suspicion that the same person might be responsible for multiple murders. This was a significant shift. Acknowledging the possibility of a serial offender changes how cases are approached. Instead of treating each crime as isolated, investigators begin looking for common threads, victim characteristics, methods, locations, timelines. When some Florida detectives began reviewing past cases with this lens, similarities stood out. Strangulation appeared repeatedly. Sexual assault was common. Bodies were often left in secluded outdoor areas. Victims were frequently women who had been traveling or living transiently. None of these traits were unique on their own. Together, they suggested a consistent modus operandi, a pattern of behavior. Gerald Eugene Stano, unaware of this evolving analysis, continued his routine that he did not notice detectives comparing notes. He did not know case files were being revisited. He remained focused on his immediate world, finding food, finding shelter, finding victims, but patterns do not require the offender's awareness to exist. They form regardless. One of the most important realizations for investigators was that the killer appeared mobile. The geographic spread of cases was too wide to suggest a single neighborhood offender. Instead, it suggested someone who traveled, someone who used highways, someone without a fixed base. This realization narrowed the field conceptually, not to a specific person, but to a type of person. A drifter, a truck driver, a transient worker, someone with access to a vehicle. This was progress, but it was still abstract. Thousands of people fit that description. Another emerging pattern involved victim vulnerability. Many victims were last seen hitchhiking. Some were sex workers. Some were young women who had recently left home. This suggested the killer targeted those who were alone and accessible. This understanding influenced police outreach. Officers began warning vulnerable populations about the danger. Community groups distributed safety information. Again, Gerald did not perceive this as directed at him, but it gradually reduced his pool of easy targets. For the first time in years, Gerald occasionally experienced longer gaps between successful approaches. More women declined rides. More expressed hesitation. More walked away. This frustrated him. Frustration, for someone like Gerald, did not lead to introspection. It led to persistence. He spent more time cruising, more time watching, more time searching. This increased exposure, more time. In public, more interactions, more chances to be noticed. He also began staying in certain areas longer than before. When he found a place where he had previously succeeded, he returned. Familiarity gave him confidence, but it also created local patterns that if multiple victims disappeared from the same general area over time, investigators were more likely to notice. Gerald's growing impatience subtly altered his behavior. He sometimes approached women more quickly. He sometimes took greater risks. Not dramatic leaps, but small shifts. A question asked sooner than before. A location chosen that was slightly less secluded. These micro changes matter. They accumulate. They increase probability of detection. Meanwhile, some detectives began creating rudimentary maps, pinning locations where bodies were found, pinning last known sightings. When viewed individually, they meant little. When viewed together, clusters emerged. Certain highways, certain corridors. This visualization reinforced the idea of a traveling offender. Still, without physical evidence linking cases, progress was slow. Forensic science at the time was limited to DNA analysis did not yet exist as an investigative tool. Fingerprints could only help if a suspect was already in the system, and if usable prints were recovered. In many outdoor dump sites, evidence was degraded. Weather, animals, time, these factors erased clues. Gerald had unknowingly chosen a disposal method that minimized forensic trace, not because he understood forensics, but because he preferred simplicity and speed. This simplicity complicated investigations. The lack of sophisticated evidence did not mean investigators were idle. They conducted interviews. They followed up on tips. They chased leads. Most led nowhere. False confessions occasionally appeared. People seeking attention. People with mental illness. People trying to insert themselves into notoriety. Each false lead consumed time and resources. Meanwhile, the real killer continued operating. Another pattern slowly became apparent. Some victims had last been seen talking to a man in a car. Descriptions were vague. White male. Average build. Unremarkable. This lack of distinctiveness was itself a pattern. The killer did not stand out. He did not have flashy characteristics. He did not announce himself that he blended. This reinforced the idea that the offender was someone who could move through society unnoticed. Gerald's greatest strength was also his greatest vulnerability, because blending in only works when no one is looking closely. And people were beginning to look more closely, not at him specifically, but at the possibility of someone like him existing. Patterns in the darkness were forming, slowly, imperfectly, but inevitably. And once patterns exist, they can be followed. As investigators continued piecing together fragments of information, another shift occurred. They began to move from asking, "Are these cases connected?" to asking, "If they are connected, what kind of person is responsible?" This transition marked the early use of behavioral profiling, not in the sophisticated, technology-driven form seen today, but as a practical attempt to infer personality from behavior. From the patterns observed, detectives began sketching a rough outline. The offender was likely male, likely acted alone, likely comfortable approaching strangers, likely socially unremarkable, likely transient or highly mobile, likely used manipulation rather than force initially, likely sexually motivated. These were broad conclusions, but they narrowed the conceptual field. They also helped investigators focus interviews and tip follow-ups. Gerald Eugene Stano fit this emerging profile almost perfectly. He did not know that. He did not imagine himself as a type, that he saw himself as unique. But uniqueness is often an illusion. Many serial offenders share common traits. Gerald was no exception. As awareness of a possible serial offender grew, some police departments began coordinating more actively. Detectives shared summaries of cases. They discussed similarities. They debated theories. These efforts were uneven. Some departments were more engaged than others. Some had more resources. Some had detectives who strongly believed in the serial pattern. Others remained skeptical. Skepticism is not necessarily a flaw. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence, but skepticism can also delay action. Gerald benefited from this tension. While law enforcement slowly built conceptual frameworks, Gerald continued killing. He remained cautious, but not cautious enough, because caution erodes under routine. Routine breeds shortcuts. Gerald occasionally violated his own informal rules. He sometimes lingered after approaching a woman longer than necessary. He sometimes spoke more than he should. He sometimes allowed himself to be seen talking with a potential victim. These deviations were small, but small deviations accumulate at the same time. Gerald's psychological state was shifting. The satisfaction he once derived from killing was diminishing. The relief was shorter-lived. The urge returned faster. This is classic tolerance. The same behavior produces diminishing returns. For many offenders, this leads to escalation, more frequent killings, sometimes more extreme violence. Gerald's escalation took the form of frequency, not dramatic changes in method, but shorter intervals between murders. This increased activity increased exposure, more time hunting, more approaches, more interactions, more chances to be noticed. Gerald also began spending more time in areas where he felt comfortable, places he had killed before, places he knew how to navigate. This comfort reduced his anxiety, but it also created geographic consistency, patterns within patterns. Investigators examining clusters of cases began focusing on certain corridors more closely: highways, rest stops, nearby towns. They canvassed areas, interviewed residents, asked about suspicious individuals. Most people reported nothing, but occasionally someone mentioned a quiet man, a drifter, a guy who hung around, a man who asked for rides or directions. These descriptions were vague, but they reinforced the conceptual profile. Still, no one had a name. That no one had a face. Gerald remained one among thousands. Meanwhile, advances in forensic thinking were slowly emerging. Even without DNA, investigators began placing more emphasis on linking cases through behavioral signatures. The combination of strangulation, sexual assault, and body disposal in remote outdoor locations became a key signature. This did not identify a suspect, but it created a working definition of the series. Cases matching that definition were flagged, reviewed, compared. The number of flagged cases grew. This growth mattered, because once a series reaches a certain size, it attracts attention. Attention brings resources. Resources bring focus. Gerald did not perceive this growing focus, that he continued living in a narrow psychological tunnel. Urge, action, relief, repeat. He did not imagine detectives studying maps, that he did not imagine families connecting with one another. He did not imagine the conceptual net slowly tightening, that he believed invisibility was permanent, that it never is. The very nature of compulsive behavior makes permanence impossible. Compulsion drives repetition. Repetition creates patterns. Patterns can be detected, even imperfectly, even slowly, but eventually. Gerald also underestimated one critical factor: chance. Not every capture happens because of brilliant detective work. Sometimes it happens because of coincidence, because of a traffic stop, because of a witness, because of a small, seemingly insignificant event. Gerald's lifestyle placed him in constant proximity to chance, driving constantly, interacting with strangers, living on the margins. Each day increased the probability that something unexpected would occur. He did not calculate this, that he relied on past success. Past success is not a reliable predictor of future safety. As patterns in the darkness became clearer to investigators, the darkness around Gerald was thinning. Not enough for him to notice, not yet, but enough that his days of total invisibility were numbered. The machine of consequence had begun to turn, slowly, relentlessly, and it was moving toward him. Chapter 9. The cracks begin to show. No matter how careful a predator believes he is, time works against him. Not dramatically, not all at once, but quietly, through accumulation, through fatigue, through small deviations from routine. By the late 1970s, Gerald Eugene Stano had been killing for years. What once felt controlled now felt compulsive. What once felt empowering now felt necessary. This shift had consequences. The more necessary the behavior became, the less patient Gerald grew. Patience had been one of his greatest protective factors. Now, it was eroding. That he spent more hours each day cruising, more time in public, more time interacting with strangers. This increased his visibility. Even if no one recognized him as a killer, more people saw him. More people remembered brief encounters. More people filed away vague impressions. A quiet man asking for directions, a drifter lingering at a rest stop, a guy who seemed off. These impressions did not mean much individually. Together, they created potential witness memory. Gerald also began staying in certain areas longer than he used to. Instead of killing once and leaving town, he sometimes remained and killed again. Familiarity bred comfort. Comfort bred repetition. Repetition bred patterns. Within some local jurisdictions, Detectives noticed multiple cases with similar characteristics occurring within relatively short time frames. This increased their confidence that they were dealing with an active offender, not historical cases, not cold files, but someone currently operating. This realization heightened urgency. More patrols were assigned to vulnerable areas. More attention was paid to reports of suspicious individuals. More effort was made to gather tips. These changes were subtle. They did not create a visible manhunt, but they shifted the environment in small ways, in environments slightly less forgiving. Gerald did not consciously register these shifts, but he felt more tension, more resistance from potential victims, more moments where approaches failed that he interpreted this as bad luck, not as changing conditions. Another crack began forming in Gerald's psychological armor: dissatisfaction. Killing no longer produced the same level of relief. The calm afterward was shorter. The emptiness returned faster. This dissatisfaction made him more irritable, more restless, more driven. He did not articulate these feelings, he simply felt wrong. And he knew only one way to fix it. This internal pressure increased the likelihood of mistakes. When someone acts under pressure, precision suffers. Small details get overlooked. Gerald sometimes chose less optimal locations. He sometimes rushed approaches. He sometimes stayed with victims longer before killing. Each of these behaviors increased risk. Still, he avoided major errors. He did not leave identification. He did not speak his real name. He did not contact police. That he did not brag. But perfection is impossible over long periods. One of the most important cracks involved survivors. Not everyone Gerald approached became a victim. Many women declined rides. Some accepted rides but exited before he could isolate them. A few experienced uncomfortable encounters and escaped. These women sometimes reported strange men to friends or authorities. Not always immediately, not always formally, but stories circulated. Descriptions overlapped. A quiet man, a drifter, a guy who asked for help. These reports did not identify Gerald, but they added to the growing sense that a particular type of offender was active. Another crack involved chance encounters with law enforcement. Gerald was occasionally stopped for minor traffic issues: broken taillight, expired registration, routine checks. Each time, he remained calm, cooperative, non-confrontational. Officers ran his information. Nothing serious appeared. He was released. These encounters reinforced his belief that he could interact with police safely. But each encounter also created a record. A timestamp, a location, a piece of data, individually meaningless, collectively potentially valuable. At this stage, no one was yet compiling these minor interactions into a comprehensive picture, but the data existed. Waiting. Gerald's physical appearance also began to change subtly over time. Years of transient living took a toll. Poor nutrition, inconsistent sleep, stress, and he looked more worn, more disheveled. This did not make him more suspicious, but it made him more noticeable. People are more likely to remember someone who looks out of place. Gerald had always looked slightly out of place. Now, that quality was intensifying. Another crack involved geography. Gerald's preference for certain corridors created overlapping case zones. Detectives reviewing maps noticed concentrations, not definitive, but suggestive. They began focusing more attention on these corridors, more patrols, more canvassing, more questioning of people who frequented those areas. Gerald did not notice this increased activity as directed at him, but it increased the background noise of law enforcement presence, more police cars, more conversations, more subtle signals that the environment was changing. The cracks were small, hairline fractures, not dramatic breaks. But cracks do not need to be dramatic. They need only exist. Over time, pressure finds them, expands them, turns them into openings. Gerald believed his past success guaranteed future safety. This belief was false. Past success only guarantees one thing: that you have not been caught. It does not guarantee you never will be. EAS. The cracks began to show. Gerald continued killing, unaware that the foundation of his invisibility was weakening, unaware that the system he believed was blind was slowly learning how to see. While Gerald Eugene Stano remained trapped inside his narrow cycle of urge and release, forces outside his awareness were beginning to align, not in a dramatic sweep, not with a single breakthrough, but through a slow convergence of circumstances. One of the most significant developments was a growing willingness among investigators to share information across county lines. Detectives who once worked almost entirely within their own jurisdictions began making phone calls, sending copies of reports, comparing case details. These efforts were imperfect, but they represented progress. Patterns that had once seemed isolated now appeared in multiple folders: strangulation, sexual assault, remote dump sites, transit victims. The repetition was hard to ignore. Some departments began creating informal lists of similar cases, not official task forces, not yet, but working groups. Detectives who took personal interest in the possibility of a serial offender. These investigators became repositories of institutional memory. They remembered details others forgot. They noticed overlaps others missed. This kind of individual dedication often drives breakthroughs, not because of extraordinary genius, but because of persistence. Gerald remained oblivious. He continued driving, continued hunting, continued believing in his invisibility. But his behavior was becoming increasingly risky. That he spent more time in areas where he had previously killed. He returned to familiar hunting grounds. Familiarity created comfort. Comfort created predictability. Predictability created vulnerability. Another subtle change involved Gerald's emotional state. He was more irritable, more impatient, less careful. That he sometimes approached women who did not fully fit his usual criteria. Women in slightly less isolated situations. Women closer to populated areas. This increased the chances of witnesses that he did not notice. Because nothing bad happened immediately, serial offenders often mistake delayed consequences for absence of consequences. They interpret survival as validation. Meanwhile, more survivors were speaking up. Women who had uncomfortable encounters began telling friends. Some contacted police. They described a man who asked for help, a man who wanted a ride, a man who seemed harmless at first. Descriptions were vague, but they were consistent. White male, average build, awkward, quiet, driving an older car. These fragments did not point to Gerald specifically, but they added texture to the conceptual profile. The idea of a traveling, manipulative offender became more concrete. Another crack involved the recovery of additional bodies. Each discovery renewed media attention. Renewed attention prompted renewed public tips. Most tips were useless, but volume matters. Among many bad tips, sometimes a useful one appears. Gerald did not monitor media closely, but he occasionally saw headlines. He did not feel alarmed. That he felt detached curiosity. Are they close? He reassured himself. They don't have me. This reassurance kept him going. But it was built on incomplete information. That he did not know that some investigators were beginning to look more closely at drifters, people with histories of transient living, individuals who moved frequently and had minor criminal records. This did not mean Gerald was on a list, but the category he belonged to was now considered relevant. This is another important shift. When law enforcement moves from anyone could be responsible to we are looking for this type of person, the field narrows. Narrowing increases the chance that the right person will eventually be encountered. Another factor was chance contact. Gerald's lifestyle placed him in frequent contact with police for minor issues. Each contact was an opportunity, not necessarily for immediate arrest, but for observation, for memory, for record that an officer might not recognize him as a killer, but might later recall speaking with a drifter who fit a description. These small cognitive links can matter later. Gerald also made a critical miscalculation that he believed that because he did not leave obvious evidence, he was safe. He underestimated the power of confessions. Not his own, but others. Some people he encountered bragged about crimes they did not commit. Some falsely confessed. Each false confession forced investigators to examine details to refine their understanding of what the real offender's behavior looked like. Ironically, false leads sometimes sharpen real profiles that by ruling out what does not fit investigators. Clarify what does. Gerald did not know that the conceptual net around him was tightening. He only knew his own experience that he had killed many times. He had not been caught. Therefore, he believed he would never be caught. This belief is one of the most consistent precursors to capture because it fosters complacency. Complacency leads to mistakes. Mistakes create openings at this stage. The cracks were still small, but they were multiplying. Invisibility was no longer absolute. It was conditional, dependent on luck, dependent on continued systemic gaps, dependent on no one connecting the right dots at the right moment. Those conditions cannot hold forever. Gerald Eugene Stano was still free, still killing, still convinced of his untouchability, but the ground beneath him was shifting, slowly, quietly, relentlessly. Chapter 10. The Arrest That Changed Everything. Serial killers are often captured not because of a masterful investigative breakthrough, but because of something small, a traffic stop, a routine question, a moment of coincidence. Gerald Eugene Stano's capture would not come from a dramatic chase or a sudden realization by police that he was the man they had been hunting for years. It would begin quietly. Like everything else in his life, by the early 1980s, Gerald's pattern of violence had continued. Long enough that the weight of his crimes was immense. Even if the full scope was not yet understood, that he was still drifting, still moving between towns, still operating along highways. But something had changed inside him. The compulsion had intensified. He felt driven more than ever. And when compulsion increases, patience decreases. One encounter would break the rhythm. It began with a woman who survived. Unlike so many before her, she did not disappear. She did not become another silent case file. She lived. Gerald had approached her with his usual method. A story, a request, an opportunity to help. At some point during the encounter, something went wrong for him. She resisted in a way he had not anticipated, or circumstances shifted, or he sensed greater risk than usual. Whatever the precise details, she escaped. And unlike others who had uncomfortable encounters and stayed silent, she reported him. She provided a description, not perfect, not detailed enough to immediately identify him, but specific, enough to matter. A white male, awkward, driving a certain type of vehicle. The kind of description that, when combined with enough other information, can narrow possibilities. Police began searching for a man matching that description, not as a confirmed serial killer, but as a suspect in a specific incident. This distinction is important. Gerald was not arrested as the highway killer. He was pursued as a suspect in an assault. That narrower focus made the search manageable. Eventually, law enforcement located him. The moment of arrest was not cinematic, dramatic standoff, confession on the roadside. Just a quiet apprehension that a man taken into custody. First, Gerald maintained his usual demeanor, calm, soft-spoken. Unremarkable. He denied serious wrongdoing, minimized behavior, attempted to present himself as misunderstood. For years, this strategy had worked, but interrogation rooms are different environments. There is no anonymity inside them. No drifting away. No blending into traffic. Just questions and time. Interrogators noticed inconsistencies, small contradictions, details that did not align. They pressed gently at first, then more firmly. Gerald was not intellectually sophisticated, that he struggled under sustained questioning, that he had spent years perfecting manipulation in short interactions. Interrogation is a different game. It requires endurance, consistency, strategic thinking. These were not his strengths. As questioning continued, something unexpected happened. Gerald began to talk, not in fragments, not cautiously, but extensively. First, he admitted to limited wrongdoing, then to more serious offenses, then to killings. Once the door of confession opened, it did not close easily. He described strangulations, remote locations, victims. That he offered details that had not been made public, details that matched known cases. Investigators were stunned. They had suspected a serial offender, but the scope Gerald described exceeded expectations. He spoke of dozens of murders, some confirmed, some unverified, some impossible to verify because bodies had never been found. Why did he confess? The answer is complex. Some serial offenders crave recognition. Gerald did not seem driven by fame. Instead, his confessions appeared to serve psychological needs: control, attention, power over investigators. That he was no longer invisible. He was the center of the room. For a man who had felt ignored his entire life, this sudden focus may have been intoxicating. There was also a possibility of strategic thinking, that he may have believed cooperation could benefit him legally, or that partial confession would control the narrative. But as he continued talking, control slipped. Each admission expanded the scale of his crimes. Each detail deepened the horror. Investigators began cross-referencing his statements with open cases. Locations matched, methods matched, timelines matched. The patterns in the darkness were converging on a single name: Gerald Eugene Stano, the drifter in plain sight, the man who had blended into highways and rest stops, the man who had relied on invisibility, was now visible, fully, painfully, irreversibly. Families who had waited years for answers began receiving calls. Some were told their loved one's case might be linked to a suspect. Others were told remains had been connected to confessions. The emotional impact was immediate and overwhelming. Shock, relief, anger, grief. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a name, a face, a person to hold responsible. But answers do not erase loss. They only clarify it. Gerald's arrest did not end suffering. It transformed it, from limbo to confrontation, from question marks to painful confirmation. Inside interrogation rooms, he continued speaking. Details poured out, some precise, some contradictory. Investigators struggled to keep up. To verified. To distinguish truth from exaggeration, because serial confessions are not always clean. Some offenders inflate numbers, some misremember, some lie for effect. Sorting fact from fiction would take time, but one truth was undeniable. Gerald Eugene Stano was not just a drifter, he was one of the most prolific serial killers in Florida history, and his capture marked the end of his freedom, but not the end of his story. Once Gerald Eugene Stano began confessing, the interrogation room transformed from a place of suspicion into a place of revelation. Detectives who had spent years chasing fragments now sat across from the source. A quiet man, thin, soft-spoken, not physically imposing, and yet calmly describing acts of extraordinary violence. First, investigators approached his statements cautiously. Serial offenders sometimes exaggerate. They sometimes seek attention. They sometimes claim responsibility for crimes they did not commit, so each confession had to be tested. Dates were checked, locations were compared, case files were reopened, maps were spread across tables. When Gerald mentioned a wooded area near a specific highway, detectives drove there. When he described a canal outside a certain town, they searched. When he gave approximate time frames, investigators matched them against missing person reports. Again and again, pieces aligned that he knew details that had never been released publicly, specific disposal sites, positions of bodies, personal items left behind. These confirmations shifted skepticism into grim understanding. This was not bravado. This was truth. As the number of admissions grew, so did the magnitude of the case. Each confession represented not just a crime, but a family, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Investigators were no longer dealing with isolated cases. They were reconstructing a trail of devastation stretching across years. News of Gerald's confessions began reaching the public. Media outlets reported that a suspect had admitted to numerous murders. Speculation spread quickly. How many victims? How long had this been happening? How had he gone undetected? The community reaction was a mix of shock and disbelief. Many struggled to reconcile the scale of the crimes with the ordinariness of the man, that he did not look like a monster. He did not speak like one, that he appeared subdued, detached, almost bland. But his words told another story. During extended interviews, Gerald sometimes described his killings with unsettling calm, that he did not display visible remorse, that he did not weep. He did not express deep regret at times. He seemed more focused on the mechanics than the human cost. This emotional detachment disturbed investigators deeply, because it suggested that for Gerald, these acts had been routine, habitual, normalized. As interrogations continued, inconsistencies also emerged. Some numbers fluctuated, some timelines shifted. This raised questions. Was he exaggerating? Was he confused? Was he attempting to inflate his notoriety? Sorting through these contradictions required meticulous work. Prosecutors and detectives prioritized cases with strong physical evidence, cases where remains had been found, cases where forensic findings aligned clearly with his admissions. The legal system demands proof beyond confession. Confession alone is rarely enough. Evidence had to be built, case by case, victim by victim. Meanwhile, Gerald's psychological state during confession drew attention. Some experts later suggested that once he began speaking, he experienced a release similar to the one he felt after killing. Confession gave him control of the narrative. He decided what to reveal, when to reveal it, how to frame it. For someone obsessed with control, this may have been gratifying. It also placed him in a new role, not as invisible predator, but as central figure. Investigators needed him. Prosecutors needed him. Media reported on him. For perhaps the first time in his life, Gerald was not ignored. This spotlight may have fueled continued disclosure, but it also sealed his fate. Each admission narrowed his legal options. Each verified case strengthened the prosecution's hand. Families began attending press conferences. Some expressed relief that the killer had been caught. Others expressed rage. Years of uncertainty had turned into confirmed horror. The name Gerald Eugene Stano became associated with their loss. In custody, Gerald no longer controlled geography. No highways, no mobility, no escape routes. His world shrank to interrogation rooms and holding cells. The man who once drove freely across the state was now confined. This confinement did not produce visible panic that he remained composed, but the reality was irreversible that he would not return to the road, he would not hunt again. The investigation expanded outward from his confessions. Detectives sought to identify unknown victims to match remains with missing persons to notify families. This process was emotionally exhausting. Each confirmation meant reopening wounds, but it also meant clarity. Clarity that had been denied for years as legal proceedings began forming. Prosecutors faced a strategic challenge. With so many potential victims, which cases should be tried? Which had the strongest evidence? Which could guarantee conviction? The goal was not to try every single murder. That would be logistically overwhelming. The goal was to secure justice effectively. That Gerald's arrest had changed everything, not only for him, but for law enforcement, for families, for communities. It validated the suspicion that a single predator had been operating. It exposed systemic gaps. It prompted reflection about how such crimes could continue undetected for so long. But above all, it ended his freedom. The drifter in plain sight was no longer drifting. The highway killer was off the highway. And the long process of accountability was about to begin. Chapter 11. Confessions Beyond Comprehension. When Gerald Eugene Stano's confessions became public, they carried a weight that was difficult to grasp, not just because of the number of victims, but because of what those confessions represented: years of hidden violence, years of unanswered questions, years of families waiting in darkness. Now, the darkness had a voice. And that voice belonged to a man who spoke calmly about acts most people cannot even imagine. Investigators quickly realized that Gerald's confessions were not a single event. They were an ongoing process. Interview after interview, day after day, that he continued to talk, sometimes freely, sometimes after prompting, sometimes contradicting himself. The volume of information was overwhelming. That he described meeting women along highways, offering rides, driving to secluded areas, strangling them, leaving their bodies, over and over. The repetition itself was horrifying. It revealed how normalized killing had become for him. For detectives, the task was no longer simply to listen. It was to organize, categorize, verify. Each claimed victim became a potential case. Each detail became a lead. Maps were covered in pins. Case files multiplied. The scope of Gerald's alleged crimes stretched across multiple counties, possibly multiple states. Some estimates suggested he may have killed over 30 women. Some estimates were higher. But estimates are not convictions. Only cases supported by evidence could be formally charged. This distinction mattered legally, but emotionally, for families, numbers were less important than truth. Was my daughter one of them? Was my sister taken by this man? Those questions haunted many. That Gerald's manner during confession disturbed many observers. He did not display visible anguish. He did not collapse into tears. He did not beg for forgiveness. Instead, he often spoke in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. If describing mundane events. This emotional detachment led some to conclude that he lacked remorse. Others suggested he simply did not express emotions conventionally. Regardless, the impact was the same. His words felt cold, mechanical. In some interviews, Gerald seemed almost eager to talk. He volunteered information without being asked. He corrected investigators when they misunderstood details. He occasionally elaborated on methods. This behavior raised questions. Was he proud? Was he seeking attention? Was he trying to control how he would be remembered? There is no single answer. Human motivation is rarely singular. It is likely that multiple factors were at play: need for attention, desire for control, possible belief that cooperation might bring leniency, psychological compulsion to talk about what he had done. Whatever the reasons, the result was unprecedented disclosure. As investigators verified confessions, the scale of Gerald's crimes became clearer. That he had not killed in one brief spree. He had killed over years. This long timeline explained why patterns had been so difficult to detect. That IT also underscored how many opportunities for intervention had been missed. Gerald's confessions also revealed something else. He often struggled to recall names. Faces blurred together. Timelines overlapped. This suggested that victims had become interchangeable in his mind. Not individuals, not people with unique lives, just components of a repetitive process. This dehumanization was central to his psychology. IT also complicated verification. If Gerald could not provide names or precise dates, matching confessions to specific cases became challenging. Investigators relied heavily on location details. Geography became the primary organizing principle. Where did he claim to have killed? Where were bodies found? Where were women last seen? Slowly, links were established. Some families received confirmation that their loved one's remains matched a confession. Others were told that their missing relative was likely among the victims, but evidence was insufficient to be certain. These conversations were devastating. For some families, confirmation brought a form of closure, painful but concrete. For others, uncertainty remained. They knew Gerald had killed many. They suspected he had killed their loved one, but could not prove it. This partial knowledge can be worse than complete ignorance. That IT leaves no firm ground to stand on. That Gerald's confessions also forced prosecutors to make difficult decisions. They could not try him for every murder. Trials are resource-intensive. They require strong evidence, witnesses, forensic proof, corroboration. Prosecutors prioritized cases with the strongest physical evidence. Cases where bodies had been recovered, cases where cause of death was clear, cases where details matched his statements precisely. The strategy was pragmatic. Secure convictions that would ensure he would never be free again. Justice, in this context, was not about counting every victim. It was about stopping him permanently. Public reaction was intense. News outlets ran stories about the scope of his confessions. Commentators debated how such a person could exist. Some framed him as a monster, others as a product of social failure. These debates, while understandable, did not change the core reality. Gerald Eugene Stano chose to kill. That he chose to repeat that choice many times. Understanding factors that shaped him can inform prevention, but it does not absolve responsibility. As the confessions continued, one truth became undeniable. The man sitting in custody was not exaggerating his darkness. That he was revealing it, layer by layer, case by case, and the full extent of what he had done would never be completely known. As Gerald Eugene Stano's confessions accumulated, investigators found themselves navigating a strange dual reality. That on one hand, they finally had a person willing to describe the horror in detail. On the other hand, each new admission created more questions than answers. Some confessions aligned neatly with known cases. Others did not. Some described murders in areas where no remains had ever been found. Some involved victims who had never been reported missing. This raised unsettling possibilities. How many of his victims had simply vanished without anyone noticing? How many families never even knew a crime had occurred? This uncertainty meant that Gerald's true victim count would likely never be known. Numbers were debated. Estimates ranged widely. But behind every number was a human being. That a life cut short. That a story unfinished. Investigators began constructing timelines based on Gerald's recollections. They charted his movements, where he claimed to have been living, where he traveled, which highways he frequented. This process resembled assembling a massive, fragmented puzzle. Pieces were missing. Some pieces were distorted. Some pieces did not fit cleanly. But a general picture emerged. Gerald had killed repeatedly over a span of years, moving across multiple regions. Selecting victims opportunistically. One of the most disturbing aspects of his confessions was how routine he made murder sound. He described it as something that just happened, as if it were an accident. As if he were a passive participant in his own actions. This language minimized agency. It framed killing as inevitable, not chosen. This framing is common among offenders who wish to distance themselves from responsibility. But investigators were not fooled. They understood that Gerald made choices. Repeatedly, that he chose to approach women, that he chose to isolate them, that he chose to strangle them, he chose to leave their bodies. Confession does not erase accountability. It only clarifies it. Psychologists who later reviewed Gerald's behavior noted traits consistent with severe personality pathology: lack of empathy, poor impulse control, shallow emotional range, manipulative tendencies. These traits did not emerge suddenly in adulthood. They were the culmination of lifelong patterns. But again, understanding development is not the same as excusing behavior. Gerald's confessions also had a chilling effect on communities. People realized that a man had been operating in plain sight for years, driving the same roads they drove, stopping at the same gas stations, passing through the same towns. This realization shattered the comforting illusion that extreme danger is always obvious. It is not. Often, it looks ordinary. This awareness led to increased caution, more public safety campaigns, more emphasis on not accepting rides from strangers, more discussions about vulnerability. These changes, while necessary, came too late for many. Families of confirmed victims faced complex emotions. Some felt relief that the killer had been caught. Some felt anger that it had taken so long. Some felt numb. Some felt all of these at once. There is no single way to process such loss. For families whose loved ones were suspected victims but not confirmed, the situation was even more complicated. They lived with a probability, not a certainty. This kind of ambiguity can be psychologically exhausting. There is no clear narrative and no definitive ending, just a persistent question. Was it him? Gerald did not provide comfort. He did not apologize meaningfully. He did not reach out to families. His focus remained largely inward, on his own situation, not on legal proceedings, and on his own narrative. This reinforced perceptions of his lack of remorse. As the legal process moved forward, Gerald faced multiple charges. Prosecutors selected cases with strong evidence. They prepared to present confessions, corroborating details, and forensic findings. Defense attorneys examined Gerald's mental state. They explored possible mental illness, intellectual limitations, childhood trauma. These factors might mitigate punishment, but they would not erase guilt. The central question was not whether Gerald had killed. It was how the legal system would respond. Life imprisonment, death penalty. The stakes were immense. Public opinion varied. Some demanded execution. Others opposed it on principle. These debates were not about Gerald as a person. They were about society's values, about how justice should be administered. For Gerald, the debates were largely abstract. He was no longer free. He would never return to the highways. The world he had inhabited for years no longer existed. He was now confined, observed, controlled. The man who had sought control through killing now had none. This reversal did not produce visible transformation. He did not suddenly become reflective. He did not express profound insight. He remained largely the same person, detached but self-focused, limited in emotional depth. The confessions beyond comprehension had accomplished one thing with certainty. They had exposed a hidden reality, a reality in which a quiet drifter had murdered repeatedly while society looked elsewhere. This exposure forced uncomfortable reflection about vulnerability, about systemic blind spots, about how easily some lives can be overlooked. Gerald Eugene Stano's confessions did not bring peace. They brought clarity, and sometimes, clarity is the most painful thing of all. Chapter 12. Inside the Mind of Gerald Eugene Stano. Understanding the mind of a serial killer does not mean sympathizing with it. It does not mean excusing what was done to it means attempting to comprehend how a human being becomes capable of repeatedly destroying other human beings. In Gerald Eugene Stano's case, this task is especially challenging because he did not fit popular stereotypes. That he was not charismatic, he was not intelligent in a traditional sense, he was not articulate in complex ways, he was not outwardly sadistic in the theatrical manner often portrayed in fiction. That he was, in many ways, painfully ordinary. Yet within that ordinariness existed a profound capacity for violence. Psychologists who later examined Gerald noted several key features of his personality. One of the most prominent was emotional detachment. Gerald had great difficulty experiencing or expressing complex emotions. He did not seem to feel empathy in a meaningful way that he could describe suffering, but he did not appear to internalize it. This emotional shallowness likely developed early. Neglect in childhood often disrupts the development of emotional regulation. Children learn empathy by being empathized with. Gerald was not. Another major feature was a deep sense of inadequacy. Despite his later grandiose self-image as a powerful killer, Gerald's core self-concept remained fragile. That he saw himself as inferior, unworthy, defective. This internal contradiction, feeling both superior and inferior, is common in predatory offenders. The grandiosity serves as armor, a defense against overwhelming shame. In Gerald's case, killing provided temporary relief from feelings of worthlessness. When he dominated someone else, he felt significant. Important. In control. But this relief was short-lived. The shame returned, which drove the urge to repeat the behavior. This cycle, shame, violence, temporary relief, shame again, is a destructive loop. Gerald also exhibited poor impulse control. That he struggled to delay gratification. When he wanted something, he wanted it immediately. This trait was evident in his criminal history beyond murder, petty theft, sexual assault, other opportunistic crimes. Impulse control is influenced by both biology and environment. Early neglect, lack of consistent discipline, cognitive limitations, all can impair its development. Gerald seemed to possess several of these risk factors. Another key element was his distorted view of women. Gerald did not see women as autonomous individuals. That he saw them as objects, tools, symbols. This dehumanization allowed him to harm without confronting the full moral weight of his actions. It also reflected broader issues in his sexual development. His exposure to sexuality was largely impersonal and exploitative. Pornography, fantasy, and no healthy modeling of mutual intimacy. As a result, sex became fused with control and domination in his mind. Not connection, not affection, control. This fusion is particularly dangerous because it turns desire into entitlement, and entitlement into justification for harm. Gerald also demonstrated a tendency toward fantasy-driven behavior. He spent large amounts of time in his own internal world, imagining scenarios, replaying past acts, anticipating future ones. Fantasy can be a normal coping mechanism, but in Gerald's case, fantasy became a rehearsal space for violence. Repeated mental rehearsal lowers psychological barriers. What is imagined repeatedly becomes easier to enact. Over time, fantasy and reality blurred. Gerald's first kill did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from years of mental rehearsal. Another important aspect was his need for control. Control was central to almost everything he did. He felt powerless as a child, powerless in school, powerless in work, powerless in relationships. Killing gave him absolute control that he decided who lived and who died. This illusion of godlike power compensated for his real-world impotence. But it was an illusion because it depended on secrecy, that on invisibility, on not being caught. Once arrested, the illusion collapsed. Yet even then, Gerald sought control through confession, by choosing what to reveal. When to reveal it, he attempted to shape how others perceived him. This suggests that his need for control extended beyond physical acts, that it permeated his entire psychology. Intellectual limitations also played a role. That Gerald's below-average intelligence did not cause his crimes, but it influenced how he thought about them. He did not develop complex justifications or philosophies. His thinking was simple. I want, I take. This simplicity made him dangerous because it removed nuance. There was little internal debate, little reflection, just impulse followed by action. One might ask whether Gerald was insane in a legal or clinical sense. The answer, according to evaluations, was no. That he understood right from wrong, that he knew killing was illegal. He took steps to avoid detection. These behaviors indicate awareness of wrongdoing. Mental illness may have been present, but it did not render him incapable of understanding his actions. This distinction matters legally and ethically. Gerald was responsible, fully. Understanding his mind reveals not a mysterious monster, but a human being with severe psychological deficits, that a person shaped by neglect, that by failure, by isolation, who chose to express his inner chaos through violence. This understanding is not comforting, but it is important, because if we frame killers as incomprehensible monsters, we learn nothing. That if we recognize patterns and risk factors, we can work toward prevention. Gerald Eugene Stano's mind was not an alien landscape. It was an extreme version of human dysfunction. One that, left unaddressed, produced catastrophic harm. Looking deeper into Gerald Eugene Stano's psychology also requires confronting an uncomfortable truth. There is no single cause, that in a single moment, in a single factor, that turns someone into a serial killer. Gerald's mind was shaped by a convergence of vulnerabilities: biological, psychological, social, environmental. Each alone might not have produced a killer. Together, they formed a volatile combination. One important element was attachment failure. Healthy attachment in childhood teaches trust. That it teaches that relationships can be sources of safety and comfort. Gerald never learned this. His earliest relationships were unstable, temporary, often neglectful. This left him without an internal blueprint for healthy connection. As an adult, he did not seek intimacy. He sought control, because control feels safer than vulnerability. Another element was identity diffusion. Gerald never developed a stable sense of who he was in a positive way. That he was not a successful student, not a valued employee, not a partner, not a father, not a respected community member. These roles often provide people with meaning. Without them, Gerald's identity remained empty. Killing filled that emptiness, not with happiness, but with definition. I am a killer. This may sound horrifying, but psychologically, having a defined identity, even a negative one, can feel better than having none at all. Gerald's identity became fused with his behavior. He did not see killing as something he did. He saw it as something he was. This fusion makes change extremely difficult if behavior equals identity. Stopping the behavior feels like erasing oneself. Another factor was moral disengagement. Gerald systematically removed moral considerations from his actions. He blamed victims. He minimized harm. He framed killing as inevitable. These cognitive distortions protected him from guilt. Guilt, when experienced, can inhibit behavior. By eliminating guilt, Gerald removed an internal brake. This allowed repetition. there was also a pattern of learned helplessness in other areas of his life that he believed he was incapable of succeeding at school, in work, in relationships. This belief discouraged effort. Why try if I will fail? But in killing, he did not experience failure, that he experienced success. Each time he killed and was not caught, the belief strengthened that I am good at this. This reinforced his investment in violence as his primary domain of competence. That Gerald's confessions also suggest a limited capacity for introspection. He did not engage in deep self-analysis, that he did not articulate complex emotional states, he did not express nuanced understanding of himself. This cognitive simplicity may have prevented him from questioning his impulses. Questioning requires reflection. Reflection requires mental flexibility. That Gerald's thinking was rigid, simplistic, black and white. Want versus don't want. Do versus don't do. This rigidity reduces the likelihood of spontaneous change. Another relevant concept is desensitization, repeated exposure to violent fantasy, and behavior reduces emotional response. What once might have felt shocking becomes normal. To Gerald's early cruelty toward animals, early sexual aggression, early petty crime. These behaviors likely contributed to gradual desensitization. By the time he committed his first murder, the psychological barrier was already weakened. Murder did not represent a sudden leap, it represented a continuation. This continuity is important. It challenges the idea of a single breaking point. Instead, Gerald crossed many small thresholds. Each one made the next easier. Social isolation also played a critical role. Humans are social creatures. That we regulate each other, we provide feedback, that we challenge harmful ideas. Gerald lived largely without this corrective influence. Close friends, meaningful relationships, one to notice changes, one to intervene. Isolation allowed his inner world to dominate, unchecked, unquestioned. This does not mean social connection alone would have saved him, but isolation removed potential buffers. Finally, there is the question of choice. Even with all these factors, Gerald made choices. He chose to approach women, that he chose to strangle them, that he chose to leave their bodies, that he chose to continue. Understanding influences does not remove agency. Gerald was not a puppet, he was an actor, a destructive one. That inside Gerald Eugene Stano's mind was not a mysterious abyss, it was a dysfunctional system, built from neglect, shame, fantasy, distorted beliefs, and repeated choices. This understanding offers no comfort to victims' families. It does not lessen pain, but it does provide insight that can inform prevention, early intervention with neglected children, better mental health services, more support for at-risk youth, stronger systems for identifying patterns of violent behavior. None of these measures guarantee prevention, but they can reduce risk. Gerald Eugene Stano's mind represents an extreme outcome, a convergence of failures, personal, familial, societal. Recognizing those failures is not about shifting blame. It is about acknowledging reality that fewer people fall into the same abyss. Chapter 13. Trial, Verdict, and Condemnation. Once Gerald Eugene Stano's confessions had been partially verified and formal charges were prepared, the focus of the case shifted from investigation to prosecution. The question was no longer whether he had killed. The question was how the legal system would respond to the scale of what he had done. Prosecutors faced a daunting task. They were dealing with a man who claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, but the court system operates on evidence, not on claims. Each charge had to be supported by corroboration, physical evidence, forensic findings, witness testimony, verified details that only the killer could have known. This meant that not every confessed murder would become a courtroom case. Instead, prosecutors selected a smaller number of cases with the strongest evidentiary foundations. The goal was strategic: secure convictions that would ensure Gerald would never be free again. Trying dozens of cases would take years. It would re-traumatize families repeatedly. It would strain resources. A focused approach was considered more humane and more effective. Defense attorneys began building their case. They explored Gerald's background, his childhood neglect, his cognitive limitations, possible mental illness. These factors were presented not to deny that he committed the acts, but to influence sentencing. To argue against the harshest possible punishment. The central legal question was whether Gerald was competent to stand trial. Competency does not mean mental health. It means the ability to understand the charges, to comprehend courtroom proceedings, to assist in one's own defense. Evaluations concluded that Gerald met this standard. He understood what was happening, that he knew the difference between right and wrong. He had attempted to avoid detection. These facts undermined any claim that he was legally insane. With competency established, proceedings moved forward. Courtrooms filled with a mix of media, law enforcement, and families of victims. For many relatives, this was the first time they saw the man accused of destroying their loved one's life. There is no universal reaction to such a moment. Some felt rage, some felt numbness, some felt a strange emptiness. Seeing Gerald did not bring back the dead. It did not erase years of pain. It simply confirmed that a human being had caused it. Gerald's demeanor in court mirrored his demeanor in interrogation: quiet, reserved, emotionally flat. He did not make dramatic outbursts. He did not express visible remorse. He did not address families. This absence of emotion angered some observers. Others interpreted it as further evidence of his psychological deficits. Prosecutors presented evidence methodically: details of specific murders, confessions, corroborating physical findings, testimony from investigators. Each piece built a picture of a man who repeatedly sought out vulnerable women, assaulted them, and killed them. The defense did not attempt to portray Gerald as innocent. That strategy would have been untenable. Instead, they emphasized mitigation. They argued that his abusive childhood, low intelligence, and mental health issues reduced his moral culpability. They suggested that execution would be excessive. This mitigation strategy reflects a broader philosophical debate within criminal justice. But to what extent should background and mental health influence punishment? There is no simple answer. The law allows such factors to be considered, but it does not require them to override the severity of the crime. The jury had to weigh competing narratives. On one side, the prosecution emphasized the calculated, repeated nature of the killings, the pattern, the choice, the absence of remorse. On the other side, the defense emphasized dysfunction, damage, limitation. After deliberation, verdicts were returned: guilty. The word carried immense weight. It represented formal acknowledgement of responsibility, not just morally, but legally. Gerald Eugene Stano was now officially a convicted serial killer. The sentencing phase was next. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. They argued that the sheer number of murders, the cruelty involved, and the ongoing threat he would pose justified the ultimate punishment. Defense attorneys argued for life imprisonment. They cited his background, his cognitive limitations, the possibility that execution would not serve justice. The judge and jury were tasked with deciding how society would respond to extraordinary evil. There is no outcome that feels adequate in such cases. No sentence can restore lost lives. No punishment can equal the harm done. The decision is symbolic. A statement of values, of boundaries, of condemnation. As sentencing approached, families prepared themselves for another emotional ordeal. Listening to legal arguments about punishment does not bring closure. It forces confrontation with the reality of loss. Again and again, Gerald sat silently through these proceedings. The man who once controlled life and death now had no control over his own fate. The system he had exploited for years was now judging him, and its judgment would be severe. The sentencing phase of Gerald Eugene Stano's trial carried a gravity that was impossible to escape. This was not simply about determining punishment. It was about how a society responds when confronted with extreme, repeated violence. Prosecutors presented aggravating factors. They emphasized the number of victims, the vulnerability of those victims, the sexual nature of the crimes. The calculated way Gerald approached, isolated, and killed. They argued that his actions demonstrated a consistent pattern of cruelty and disregard for human life. This was not a single impulsive act. That it was a sustained campaign of violence. The defense responded with mitigating factors. They described Gerald's early abandonment, his years in foster care, his cognitive limitations, his emotional immaturity. They suggested that he was a deeply damaged individual whose life had been shaped by forces beyond his control. They argued that life imprisonment without parole would be sufficient to protect society. These arguments did not deny the horror of the crimes. They attempted to contextualize them. The jury was tasked with weighing these competing narratives, not in an abstract philosophical sense, but in a concrete legal one. That they had to decide whether Gerald's life should be taken by the state or whether he should spend the rest of his life in prison. There is no mathematical formula for such decisions. Jurors are instructed to consider evidence, law, and their own conscience. This burden is heavy for families of victims. The sentencing phase was agonizing. Some wanted execution. They believed nothing less could reflect the severity of what Gerald had done. Others opposed the death penalty on principle. Even for someone like Gerald, some families were divided internally. There is no single correct emotional response to such circumstances. Each person processes grief differently. When the sentencing decision was announced, the court fell silent. Gerald Eugene Stano was sentenced to death. The verdict represented the legal system's ultimate condemnation. It was a statement that his crimes were so severe, so numerous, and so devastating that he would forfeit his right to live. Gerald's reaction was minimal. He did not shout. He did not collapse. He did not protest loudly. He absorbed the sentence with the same flat demeanor he had shown throughout the proceedings. This emotional flatness was consistent with everything observers had seen. For families, the sentence produced mixed reactions. Some felt a sense of justice, not happiness, not relief, but a sense that the system had recognized the magnitude of their loss. Others felt empty, because no sentence brings loved ones back. The death sentence did not end the legal process. Automatic appeals followed. This is standard in capital cases. Courts review procedures to ensure that constitutional rights were not violated. These appeals can take years, sometimes decades. During this time, the convicted person remains on death row. Gerald was transferred to a high-security prison. His world became a small cell. Controlled movement, strict routines. The highways that had once defined his life were gone. In their place were concrete walls and metal bars. On death row, Gerald lived in isolation for long periods. Contact with other inmates was limited. His interactions were primarily with guards, attorneys, and occasional visitors. This environment was stark, monotonous, highly controlled. Some inmates on death row become reflective. Some express remorse. Some become bitter. Reports suggest that Gerald remained largely unchanged, that he did not develop a public narrative of repentance, that he did not become an outspoken advocate against violence. He did not display significant personal growth that he waited. Time on death row passes differently. Days blur together. Years stretch. The future is a fixed point. Execution. Or, in rare cases, commutation. Gerald's appeals were ultimately unsuccessful. Courts upheld his convictions and sentence. The legal system concluded that the trial had been fair and that the punishment was lawful. As the years passed, Gerald became less visible in media. New cases captured public attention. His name faded from headlines, but he did not fade from the memories of those directly affected. Families continued to carry their loss. Some attended parole hearings and appeal hearings. Some chose not to. Each interaction with the legal system reopened wounds. The death sentence represented closure for some. For others, it represented a prolonged waiting period. The idea that a person responsible for so much suffering continued to exist, even behind bars, was painful. Yet the alternative, state-sanctioned execution, also raised moral questions. These tensions are inherent in capital punishment. They do not resolve easily. Gerald Eugene Stano had been condemned by the courts, by society, by history. He would never walk free again. His days would end in custody. The boy who no one wanted. The drifter in plain sight. The serial killer who haunted Florida's highways, now reduced to a condemned prisoner, waiting. Chapter 14. Waiting for Death. Death row is not dramatic. It is not constant chaos. It is not the intense, cinematic environment often portrayed on screen. It is slow, controlled, repetitive. For Gerald Eugene Stano, the man who once defined himself through movement, death row represented the opposite of everything he had known: stillness, confinement. Routine imposed by others. No highways, no late-night drives, no restless wandering. Just a cell. A narrow space with concrete walls, a metal bed, a small desk, and little else. Time on death row stretches differently. Days are measured not by events, but by routine. Wake up, meals delivered, limited recreation, return to the cell, lights out. Repeat. For someone like Gerald, who had lived for years in constant motion, this environment stripped away autonomy. That he could no longer decide where to go, that he could no longer choose his surroundings, he could no longer act on impulse. His life was now scheduled, regulated, observed. There is a profound psychological shift. When a person who once exerted control over life and death loses control over his own. Gerald, who once selected victims and decided when their lives would end, now faced a system that had decided he had no authority in that equation. Reports from prison officials described him as quiet, compliant, not disruptive. He did not become a high-profile inmate, that he did not seek media attention, that he did not write manifestos. He did not attempt to transform himself into a symbol. He remained largely as he had always appeared: withdrawn, emotionally flat, limited in expression. Death row often becomes a place of reflection for some inmates. Some write letters, some express regret, some seek religious guidance, some attempt to reinterpret their lives. There is little evidence that Gerald underwent a dramatic moral transformation. He did not publicly confess newfound empathy. He did not issue heartfelt apologies to families. He existed in the same psychological frame that had defined him. Before. Self-focused, detached. This consistency troubled some observers. They wondered whether genuine remorse was ever possible for someone like him. Psychologists debate whether individuals with severe personality disorders can truly experience remorse in conventional ways. Remorse requires empathy. Empathy requires the ability to internalize another person's suffering. Gerald had shown little capacity for this throughout his life. Yet even if he felt something internally, he did not display it. Outwardly, death row also brought the reality of appeals. Capital punishment cases move through multiple layers of review. Attorneys examine trial transcripts. They search for procedural errors. They raise constitutional questions. This process can take years. During this time, the execution date is uncertain. Inmates live in a state of suspended finality, knowing death is the ultimate destination, not knowing exactly when. For families of victims, this prolonged process can be painful. Each appeal reopens the case. Each court date revives media coverage. Each legal motion extends the timeline. Justice, in capital cases, is rarely swift. Gerald's appeals did not produce reversals. Courts upheld the original sentence. The legal system affirmed that his crimes warranted the punishment imposed. As the years passed, Gerald aged. The youthful drifter became a middle-aged man behind bars. Time, which he once used to haunt, now worked against him. He could not escape it. He could not outrun it. He could only endure it. There is a paradox in capital punishment cases. The state declares that a person's crimes merit death, but the process of carrying out that sentence can take decades. In that time, the condemned individual continues to live. That to eat, that to sleep, that to exist. This paradox is part of the broader debate about capital punishment. For Gerald, the debate was abstract. His reality was concrete. A cell, limited contact, occasional visits, legal consultations, monitored phone calls. He did not have the freedom he wants. Abused, that he did not have access to vulnerable strangers, that he did not have highways, that he had walls. Prison staff sometimes described him as unremarkable, that he followed rules. He did not cause major disturbances. This ordinariness persisted. Even in the most extreme circumstances, that it reinforced a haunting truth. Gerald Eugene Stano did not look like the embodiment of horror. He looked like a ordinary man, which makes the scale of his crimes more unsettling, because it reminds us that extraordinary violence can be committed by those who appear utterly average. As execution approached, procedural steps intensified. Dates were scheduled, documents prepared, witness lists assembled. The state moved closer to carrying out its sentence. That Gerald's life, once defined by movement, was narrowing to a single fixed point, in execution chamber. That a final act. For the families of victims, this approach triggered mixed emotions. Some felt anticipation of closure. Others felt renewed anguish. Capital punishment does not erase trauma. It does not restore lost years. It does not silence memories. It is an act of finality, symbolic and irreversible. Gerald Eugene Stano, who once controlled the fate of others, now waited for his own. As the final phase of Gerald Eugene Stano's life approached, the machinery of capital punishment moved forward with quiet precision. There were no crowds gathered outside the prison gates, no spectacle, no dramatic build-up. Just administrative steps, paperwork, schedules, notifications. For the state, execution is a legal procedure. For the condemned, it is the end of existence. Gerald was informed of his execution date. This moment carries enormous psychological weight for many inmates. Some react with panic, some with despair, some with anger, some with denial. Gerald's reaction, according to those who observed him, was subdued, consistent with his long-standing emotional flatness. He did not make public statements. He did not issue apologies through the media. He did not seek to shape his legacy. He remained largely silent in the weeks leading up to execution. Death row inmates are often given certain allowances, final visits, access to clergy if requested, opportunity to write letters. Gerald's engagement with these options was minimal. He did not become outwardly spiritual. He did not attempt to reconcile with families. He did not engage in dramatic acts of contrition. This absence of visible remorse reinforced perceptions that he remained psychologically unchanged. On the day of execution, standard protocol was followed. Gerald was escorted from his cell, that he was searched, he was placed in restraints, he was taken to the execution chamber. Witnesses included prison officials, legal representatives, and media observers. Some families of victims chose to attend, others did not. Both choices are understandable. Being present at an execution can feel like reclaiming power. It can also feel unbearable. Gerald was executed by electrocution. The method reflected the practices of the state at that time. The process was clinical, controlled, impersonal. A stark contrast to the chaotic violence he had inflicted on others. He did not give a final speech. He did not express last-minute remorse. He did not name victims. He died largely as he had lived, quiet, detached, unremarkable in demeanor. The execution marked the legal end of Gerald Eugene Stano, but it did not mark an emotional end for those affected by his crimes. Families returned home. Some felt a sense of finality. Others felt empty. Some felt renewed grief. There is no universal reaction to the death of a killer. Closure is not a guaranteed outcome. For some, knowing that the person responsible can no longer harm anyone brings relief. For others, the absence of further legal proceedings simply leaves space where pain remains. Public reaction to the execution was muted compared to earlier stages of the case. By the time Gerald was executed, years had passed since his arrest. Media attention had shifted to other stories. Yet within affected communities, his name still carried weight, still evoked memories, still represented loss. That Gerald's death did not answer every question. The true number of his victims remains uncertain. Some families never received confirmation. Some remains were never identified. Some cases remain open in records, even if practically closed. These unresolved threads are part of his legacy, not in a glorifying sense, but in a tragic one. His story also left behind lessons about vulnerability, about the consequences of neglect, about the importance of early intervention, about the need for better systems to connect cases across jurisdictions, about how easily predators can exploit blind spots. None of these lessons undo what happened, but they matter. They represent the possibility that future harm might be prevented. Gerald Eugene Stano's life began in abandonment. It ended in execution. Between those points was a trail of devastation that cannot be erased. He is remembered not for who he was as a person, but for what he did and for the lives he destroyed. His name is a reminder of a harsh reality. That evil does not always announce itself. That monsters do not always look monstrous. That vigilance, compassion, and strong systems matter. Because somewhere, right now, there are people who are vulnerable, people who need protection, people whose lives have value. The story of Gerald Eugene Stano is not just about a killer. It is about the cost of failure. Personal, familial, societal, and about the responsibility we all share to notice, to care, and to act before darkness has the chance to grow unchecked. Chapter 15. The Legacy of a Monster. When the life of a serial killer ends, a strange question lingers. What remains? Not of the person, but of the damage. Because while an execution or life sentence stops further violence, it does not undo what has already happened. Gerald Eugene Stano's physical existence ended inside a prison. But the consequences of his actions continue to exist in countless invisible ways. They exist in families that were permanently altered. In communities that learned, painfully, that danger can hide in plain sight. In law enforcement records filled with case numbers that represent real people. In gaps where answers should be. One part of Gerald's legacy is numerical. Estimates, counts, Debates about how many victims he truly had. Some numbers are officially recognized, others are speculative, but focusing solely on numbers risks missing the deeper truth. Each victim was a person, not a statistic, not a person with a history, with relationships, with a future that was taken. The fact that some victims remain unidentified is itself a form of ongoing tragedy. It means that even in death, some individuals were denied full recognition, denied a name, denied a place in public memory. Another part of Gerald's legacy is institutional. His case exposed weaknesses in how missing person cases were handled, how information was shared, how patterns were recognized. In the years following his capture, law enforcement agencies increasingly invested in centralized databases, improved communication systems, task forces designed to look for serial patterns. These improvements were not solely because of Gerald, but cases like his contributed to momentum for change. The realization that one person could kill repeatedly across jurisdictions without detection forced reflection. It forced adaptation. His case also contributed to public awareness. People became more cautious about accepting rides from strangers. Communities discussed safety more openly. Vulnerable populations received more targeted warnings. These shifts do not eliminate risk, but they can reduce it. Another aspect of Gerald's legacy is psychological. His story challenges simplistic explanations of evil. He was not a supernatural being, not a creature from a horror film. He was a human being shaped by neglect, dysfunction, and repeated harmful choices. This reality is uncomfortable because it suggests that extreme violence can grow out of ordinary circumstances, not inevitable, not predetermined, but possible. Recognizing this does not mean accepting it. It means acknowledging that prevention is complex. It requires early intervention, support for at-risk children, accessible mental health services, education about healthy relationships, systems that respond quickly to warning signs. These are not abstract ideals. They are practical necessities. Gerald's legacy also lives in the ongoing grief of families. Grief does not follow a neat timeline. It does not end with a verdict. It does not end with an execution. It evolves. Some families channel grief into advocacy, others into private remembrance. Some struggle quietly. All carry a weight that did not exist before Gerald entered their lives. That weight is part of his true impact, not his notoriety, not his name, but the suffering he caused. There is a temptation in true crime storytelling to focus heavily on the killer. To analyze, to dissect, to explore every detail of their life. This can be informative, but it can also unintentionally center the wrong person. Gerald Eugene Stano is not the most important figure in his own story. The most important figures are the victims, the women whose lives were cut short, the families who lost them, the communities that felt the ripple effects. Any meaningful legacy must keep that perspective. Another element of Gerald's legacy is cautionary. He demonstrated how predators exploit invisibility, how they move through spaces where no one is watching closely, how they rely on assumptions that strangers are mostly harmless, that danger looks a certain way, that evil announces itself. These assumptions are comforting. They are also false. Safety requires awareness, not paranoia, but attention, noticing patterns, trusting instincts, taking reports seriously, providing resources for those in danger. Gerald's story also raises difficult questions about capital punishment. Some view his execution as justice. Others view it as another act of state-sanctioned killing. These debates are complex. They do not have simple answers. What is clear is that no punishment can balance the scale. No sentence can equal the harm. Justice, in cases like this, is imperfect by nature. It can only aim to prevent further harm and acknowledge wrongdoing. Gerald Eugene Stano's life is not a story of destiny. It is a story of failure layered upon failure. Personal failures, familial failures, systemic failures, and personal choices that transform those failures into atrocity. Remembering his story should not be about fascination. It should not be about glorification. It should be about recognition. Recognition of warning signs, recognition of vulnerability, recognition of the need for vigilance and compassion. Because while Gerald is gone, the conditions that produced him still exist. Neglect still exists. Abuse still exists. Isolation still exists. So does the potential for intervention. The potential for change. The potential to notice a struggling child. To support a vulnerable adult. To connect dots. To take concerns seriously. If Gerald Eugene Stano's story has any value beyond documenting horror, it is in what it teaches, not about him, but about us. Legacy is not something a person chooses. It is something left behind, often unintentionally, often unwillingly. Gerald Eugene Stano did not set out to create a legacy. He did not seek historical significance. He did not attempt to build an ideology or a movement. He acted out of compulsion, resentment, and distorted desire. Yet the consequences of those actions shaped lives, policies, and awareness in ways he never considered. One of the most important aspects of Gerald's legacy is how it underscores the fragility of invisibility. For years, he operated because no one saw the full picture. Each individual crime existed in isolation. Each disappearance was treated as a separate tragedy. It was only when patterns were recognized that the truth emerged. This teaches a crucial lesson. Information silos are dangerous. When systems do not communicate, predators thrive. Modern law enforcement places much greater emphasis on data sharing. Centralized databases. Cross-jurisdiction task forces, national missing persons systems. These tools are not perfect, but they are direct responses to cases like Gerald's. They represent society learning from failure. Another part of Gerald's legacy is the reminder that vulnerability is not evenly distributed. Some people are more protected than others. Some disappearances receive immediate attention, others do not. This imbalance is not accidental. It reflects social attitudes, economic inequality, marginalization. Gerald targeted those who lived on the edges of society, not because he articulated a theory about inequality, but because he sensed that these individuals were easier to isolate, easier to erase. Acknowledging this reality is uncomfortable, but necessary. Protecting vulnerable populations is not charity. It is justice. It is prevention. It is recognition of equal human worth. Gerald's story also illustrates how early warning signs are often ignored or minimized. Chronic cruelty, persistent lying, lack of empathy, sexual aggression. These behaviors do not automatically create killers, but they are red flags. They indicate a child or adolescent in serious distress. Intervention at these stages matters, not punitive, but therapeutic, supportive, structured. Gerald did not receive meaningful intervention. That absence did not cause his crimes, but it removed potential barriers. It allowed dysfunction to deepen unchecked. His legacy also challenges the way society talks about monsters. When we describe people like Gerald as inhuman, we distance ourselves from the uncomfortable truth that they are human. Humans with severe dysfunction. Humans who made catastrophic choices. Calling them monsters can feel satisfying, but it can also obscure prevention. If monsters are something other than human, then ordinary human warning signs seem irrelevant. Recognizing humanity does not mean forgiving. It means understanding. Understanding is a tool, not a pardon. Another element of Gerald's legacy is the reminder that attention should remain on victims. True crime. Narratives often risk centering perpetrators, analyzing their psychology, detailing their lives. This can be valuable, but it must never overshadow the people who were harmed. The women Gerald killed had names, histories, dreams, relationships. They mattered. Their lives mattered. Any meaningful remembrance must prioritize that truth that Gerald's execution closed a legal chapter, but it did not close emotional ones. Some families found a measure of peace, others did not. Both reactions are valid. Grief is not. Solved by legal outcomes that it is lived with, carried, integrated. The passage of time does not erase loss that it changes its shape. Gerald Eugene Stano's story ultimately forces a confrontation with uncomfortable realities. That evil can be ordinary, that danger can be quiet, that prevention requires effort, resources, and compassion, that ignoring suffering has consequences. If there is a final lesson to be taken, it is this. Pay attention to children who are falling through the cracks, to people who are isolated, to patterns that feel wrong, to instincts that signal danger, to voices that are not being heard. Because behind every statistic is a human being. Behind every case file is a family. Behind every pattern is a story waiting to be understood before it becomes tragedy. Gerald Eugene Stano is gone, but the responsibility to learn from what happened remains. That responsibility belongs to all of us.